Good morning. Senate Education Committee will come to order. Members, we will begin in earnest on Interim Study 2023-64. Just some administrative items, please. If you are speaking, if you would not mind engaging your microphone, there's a little button there, and that microphone will turn red. And then when you're done speaking, if you'll turn it off, and that cues our audiovisual system to whoever the speaker is or the questioner. So if you'll just remember to do that for those who are watching our live stream. If you're not a committee member, welcome. However, this education committee is strictly for committee members and with respect to asking questions and making comments. So for Senator Standridge, the presenter, and for committee members, if you do have a question, just get my attention, and then I will make sure that we can, if we need to, we can pause the presentation and we can ask questions of the presenters or of the author of the study. And we do have some time here, so we may take a break somewhere around halftime of the interim study, just to give us a chance to get up and take a bio break and then reconvene. So, and since I'm without a vice chair, I may have to take advantage of that this morning. So with that, Senator Standridge, good morning, and you are welcome to present your interim study.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Is it okay for me to present from here? Okay. Thank you, and welcome to everybody that came this morning. Appreciate you coming. This study has come together over a few months, and I have bios for each of those speaking, but the bios should be in front of you, and so instead of going through a long bio and maybe leaving stuff out or leaving someone out, I'll ask each presenter to identify themselves, give us a little bit of information about yourself, and then tell us what you have to say. The list of presenters is really an international group of very well-known groups, well-known experts in this area from all over the country, and so you can see that in their bios. I did want to thank, of course, my assistant for helping plan this out, and staff, and Suzanne Reynolds, if I see her somewhere. Where was she? Okay. All right. Appreciate your help, Suzanne. Thank you. And so a lot of work went in. OCPA helped a lot. Brandon Dutcher and those folks, always seem to be thanking them. They helped a lot in bringing this study together. So appreciate their time. Just really briefly, I wanted to give just a couple words why this has weighed heavy on my heart over the last few years. I filed legislation to try to put an end to this, what I call and have been calling DEI, which is divisive exclusion and indoctrination. I think that that's a better term for that terms for that acronym. I think it's really destroying our higher ed institutions, and it's really hurting both our faculty and our students. And I've had many parents and faculty, both friends, family and friends, that have complained to me about this for quite a few years. But it's that last piece, that indoctrination piece, that we probably won't talk about that much, that really almost bothers me the worst. And you'll see that as the kids come on campus. You know, when I was in school, as my 10-year-old would say, back in my day, a few years ago, back in the 90s, I never expected to go to college and see, you know, the university spending money on pastors, evangelicals, and priests and other ideologues to try to push their beliefs on me. I never expected that. I mean, I was just a kid, but I never expected that, and I think I would have been surprised to see that. But today, that's what we see all over our college campuses, is ideology being crammed down the throats of young kids. And I'm no Bible thumper, but I don't think there's a worse crime or a quicker ticket to hell than to corrupt our young children, and I'm really bothered by that. And I would probably be surprised if Christianity was pushed on them, but this other ideology is very harmful to these young people. And to arbitrarily say they're adults at 18 and we can do what we want is not fair to them. It's not fair to the taxpayers that have different beliefs, that their money is the money that that's being used to promote that. And, you know, I saw the OU Sooner Camp. I didn't see any Bible study, which I would have been surprised to see that, but we see queer tours and drag shows and drag bingo for all these young kids coming onto campus. I mean, is that really what we want to spend our money and time doing? Shouldn't we just talk to them about math and science and English and just let them start studying? But our first speaker this morning is Allison Garrett, and you should have Chancellor Garrett's bio in front of you. Chancellor Garrett is the Chief Executive Operator for the State System of Higher Education. And Chancellor Garrett, if you could, let's see what, again, we've got a lot of speakers from around the country, so I apologize if the timing didn't end up exactly how everybody asked, but I do have you slotted from 9:05 to 9:25. Hopefully I didn't take too much of your time. And Chancellor Garrett, if you wouldn't mind identifying yourself and maybe give us some information from your point of view on DEI and higher ed.
Thank you so much. Let's see, is this on now? All right, thank you so much, Senator Standridge, and it is a real privilege to be with all of you today and to share a little bit about our higher education system. As the Senator requested, I'll give you just a quick little bit of biographical information. I am a relative newcomer in the higher ed space, and that I've worked in higher education for about 20 years. Before that, I was a corporate executive working at a little company in Bentonville, Arkansas, where I served as Vice President and General Counsel for Corporate Legal Services. Moved from there into higher education, working at 3 faith-based higher education entities, and then moved on to a public institution, and now I serve as the Chancellor for Higher Education here in the state of Oklahoma, and it is my great privilege to do so. I'm delighted to spend a little bit of time with you today just talking about the concepts of diversity, equity, and inclusion in higher education. I'm going to start by just setting the playing field a bit, if you will, talking about what the state of Oklahoma looks like now and who it is that our educational institutions are serving. And I've got both the K-12 and the higher ed demographic information up there. When you look statewide at our higher ed institutions, and I'm just talking about the publics right now, non-white students currently account for about 46% of the undergraduate student enrollment at our higher ed institutions. We have 11 institutions of the 25 that are majority non-white at the undergraduate level. And we have another 6 that will probably transition to majority non-white in the next few years. Looking at K-12, it is somewhat more diverse than our higher education institutions are. And so we expect our higher education institutions to continue the transition as well. At the K-12 level, under 18 students, K-12 students have been majority non-white in the state of Oklahoma for some time. And of course, as you look forward to the workforce transitions, we see that over the next several years, we'll see additional transitions. In 2032, the majority of the working class in this state will be non-white. In 2039, the majority of all working age adults. And in about 2045 or 2046, the state population makes that shift, which is about when the rest of the United States makes that shift. When we talk about higher education and who are the diverse students that we are serving, there are enormous differences in our student population, and they represent a lot of different diverse groups. And we'll just quickly kind of talk about some of those diverse groups being served on our college campuses today. We have a lot of veterans who are being served. We have first-generation students, low-income students, students with food, medical, or housing insecurities. There's some national data that indicates that across higher education nationally, about 1/3 of all college students have food insecurity at least once in every month. We have adult learners, students of color, women or men in certain fields of study, and I'll just mention a couple. Men tend to be underrepresented in the fields of education and nursing, while women tend to be underrepresented in a field like engineering. We have international students, some of whom may be refugees, mental health challenges. Single parents make up a pretty sizable population on some of our campuses. At Cameron University, for example, the majority of students are caregivers for someone. Students with different gender identities, students who are aging out of foster care, and students with different abilities and disabilities. And so we are serving a variety of students across our higher ed institutions. And I would note we're probably no different than private higher ed institutions as well in serving a variety of students across the student population. We have a lot of federal requirements with which we must comply, and beyond the First Amendment, which you're all familiar with, I'll just note these particular federal laws. The requirement that we provide equal protection generally, a requirement that we provide fairness in how we distribute financial aid, requirements that women are treated fairly, or that in women's sports, women have the same opportunities as men. And then the ADA, which requires a variety of accommodations in order to provide for equal opportunities for students who may have differences in their abilities. As we look at one of the most important things from a higher ed standpoint that might be something some of you are a little less familiar with, I want to talk for just a minute about accreditation. All of our higher ed institutions, indeed most of the privates as well in the state of Oklahoma, are accredited by the Higher Learning Commission. They pay us a lovely visit once every 5 years. And in preparation for that visit every 5 years, every educational institution has to do a tremendous amount of work to assemble evidence of our compliance with the standards for accreditation. Among other things, we know that accreditation impacts our institutions and our students in some significant ways. From a financial aid perspective, there are types of financial aid that students cannot access if the institution that they attend is not accredited. A student who is studying at an institution that is not accredited will most likely be unable to transfer those credits to an accredited institution. And then finally, when it comes to employment or professional licensure or even movement into graduate school, if you have attended an unaccredited institution, you are likely to have some challenges in getting professional licensure, becoming employed, or maybe even going on to graduate school. Accreditation is really of two types. There is the general accreditation for all of us. It is the Higher Learning Commission. And then there are program-specific accreditations for many of our programs. And I'd like to spend just a quick minute sharing a bit about Higher Learning Commission standards and then looking at program-specific accreditations. So when you look at the Higher Learning Commission accreditation standards, we have to prove that we are providing opportunities for civic engagement in a diverse multicultural society and globally connected world. We have to prove that we are providing inclusive and equitable treatment of diverse populations. We must prove that we are fostering a climate of respect among those from a range of diverse backgrounds, ideas, and perspectives. We have to prove that we are offering education that recognizes human and cultural diversity, and that the overall composition of those employed is reflective of human diversity as appropriate for our institutions. Again, Higher Learning Commission not only accredits all of the public institutions in our state, but most of the privates as well. And as someone who has worked in-state at a private faith-based institution, I understand the application of these standards to private institutions as well. We'll move on now and just look briefly at accreditation for specific programs. And these are simply examples. If you were to look across the broad range of academic programs that are provided in higher education institutions, and again, it's applicable to the private institutions as well as the publics, you would find that there are specific standards that reflect concern with whether our institutions of higher education are appropriately preparing students for the diverse workforce and to serve the diverse population once they graduate. And we'll start with nursing, which requires integration of diversity, equity, and inclusion in the nursing curriculum. ABET, which accredits engineering programs around the country, also has diversity standards. And I'll note that what is shown here is something that ABET has proposed. I don't know that they will move forward with that, but they do have current accreditation standards as well that include demonstrating that the students who are studying engineering are prepared to serve a broad range of the population. And so that might be in terms of the workforce or in terms of for whom design is occurring. Educator preparation, teacher preparation. We have to include equity and diversity measures in our educator preparation, and we have to demonstrate progress toward recruiting a pool of teacher ed candidates that look like our population. In the schools of business, many of which are AACSB accredited, there are standards as well, the American Bar Association, the Accreditation Council for Pharmacy Education. We could go on because across different educational programs, most of the program-specific accrediting bodies will have some kind of standards that relate to how well we serve diverse students and how well we prepare all of our students to go out into a very diverse world. I'm going to move on now and spend just a moment talking about another aspect of college life, and that is athletics. When we look at athletic programs across higher ed institutions, and again, this would be applicable to private institutions as well as the publics, which tend to be in these same kinds of athletic organizations. We've got the NCAA. It has 3 different divisions, Division I, Division II, Division III. There's also the NJCAA, the National Junior College Athletic Association. Our 2-year institutions tend to be in that. And the NAIA, which is another athletic organization that covers many of our regional institutions. And in each instance, there are requirements regarding diversity, equity, and inclusion. For example, Division I institutions have to complete an equity, diversity, and inclusion review at least once every 4 years. Across all of these athletic organizations, there's a requirement that you have a senior woman administrator, so someone who specifically with respect to women in athletics can help ensure that our institutions are providing full opportunities for women as well. And so it's not just in the areas of academics that we deal with these requirements, but also in athletics as well. I'm going to move on and just spend a moment talking about an aspect of our student population and student engagement that on college campuses tends to be very, very important for our students. We have students across our college campuses who form all kinds of organizations. And of course, under the First Amendment, they have the right of freedom of association as well as freedom of expression. And so they form a variety of organizations that reflect a variety of their interests. And our student government associations, which disperse the fees from students to student-led organizations, are required to do that on a viewpoint neutral basis. And as you look at the kinds of organizations, we've got a few examples here. I'm just going to mention a couple here. I mentioned knitting because at the school where I was a president, we had the Unwind Club. And so you just never know what the interest level will be. We have organizations that are faith-based organizations, that are politically oriented organizations. So lots of different student-led events on our campuses occur. And so those reflect the full diversity of views and interests, and they reflect not only things that might be considered more progressive views, but also fairly conservative views or faith-based views as well. And it's just simply reflective of our society and part of students exercising their First Amendment rights on our campuses. I'm just going to move on lastly to sharing a bit about the workforce. I mentioned earlier that over the next several years, we will see the majority of our workforce become non-white, and corporations around the country seem very interested in assuring that their workforce is a workforce that values all viewpoints, that they are successful in attracting the workforce that they need. And so it's no surprise that if you look at most companies' websites, you find information about how they, within their company, are addressing issues of diversity, equity, and inclusion. So we're trying very hard in our higher ed system to prepare students for that workforce that they are entering. And our hope is that as they complete their college degrees, that they will be wonderful contributing members of our society as our society continues to evolve. And with that, Mr. Chair, I'd be happy to stand for questions.
Thank you, Madam Chancellor. Senator Standridge, the floor is yours if you have any questions, and if not, members of the committee, if you have any questions for the Chancellor.
Might have one quick one. Thank you, Chancellor. Appreciate the information.
Oh, my pleasure.
I've watched a number of debates at other higher ed institutions, one recently at MIT. It was pretty illuminating. The concern is that and I understand what you're saying, so I'm not trying to disrespect what you're saying, but in an effort to try to make this pot of people look like this pot of people, there's been some definite discrimination around the country in several very renowned institutions of higher ed, especially in medical and STEM. And certainly you alluded to athletics. I'm not suggesting that we go in athletics and put a bunch of white kids like me in there. Maybe that wouldn't, but it almost sounds like what you want to do is make all these pots of people. So, I assume you're not suggesting eliminating a third of the football team or half of the football team to try to make it look like another pot. So aren't you concerned down that same theme? I mean, I'm being honest here. I'm not suggesting that at all. I think the best athlete should be the one that goes on the field. Shouldn't we have that same philosophy towards those that enter law school or those that enter medical school or those that want to be involved in a certain project? I mean, to go around trying to make all these groups look like other groups, aren't you concerned we're going to go down the same path that other higher ed universities have done and undermine the very purpose of the university?
Well, first I would note that I believe our institutions try very, very hard to provide that level of fairness that you're referencing. And I'm not particularly concerned with whether our universities look like other universities. What I do see across our state is 25 very unique institutions. Some have athletics, some have no athletics, some have dorms on campus, some don't. Lots of different levels of study. And what I'm concerned about is every single one of our institutions providing opportunities for the students who select that institution to fulfill their God-given abilities to the best of their ability to do well in whatever field of study that they choose. And whatever those supports may look like, we try very hard to provide, whether it's a student who's underprepared for college or a student who needs access to a food pantry from time to time. So we do try very hard to provide the supports that students need to be successful once they've chosen our institutions. And our institutions look very different. I think if you were to look across our institutions, you would see a variety in viewpoints, maybe based on whether an institution is an urban institution or a rural institution or the kinds of programs that that institution has.
Thank you.
Senator Standridge, anything additional questions? Members, will there be additional questions of Chancellor Garrett? Madam Chancellor, thank you very much for being here. You are more than welcome to stick around in case there are questions of the state regents or higher ed system. I know you have some other obligations as well.
Well, thank you so much. We do have a meeting today, and with apologies, I will bow out, but I know that there are others from higher ed who are here. So thank you so much for the opportunity.
Great. Thank you, Madam Chancellor. Senator Standridge.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And next, Dr. James Lindsay is here. Dr. Lindsay is a world-renowned author and opinion artist on a number of things. DEI is one of those areas that he's researched quite a bit. And Dr. Lindsay, if you could make your way to the microphone, and I'll let him maybe tell you a little bit more about his work on DEI, but Dr. James Lindsay.
Thank you, Senator. How long do I have, by the way? Half an hour, 20 minutes?
About a half hour.
Okay, I'll set a timer to protect you. I do tend to talk a lot. So a little bit about my background as requested. I have been studying what some people colloquially call woke literature, or the critical social justice literature, or whether you want postmodern, neo-Marxist, cultural Marxist, critical Marxist, regular Marxist, Hegelian academic literature for about 6 years full-time. While I don't have any degrees in any of these fields, I don't think they will give me one. I did publish a number of academic papers in 2017 and 18 in these fields, 7 of them as a matter of fact. And I have a Ph.D. in mathematics from the University of Tennessee, as far as credentialing myself goes. I created a website called New Discourses, a company called New Discourses, that I dedicated my life to going and speaking on this issue and writing about this issue and providing information about DEI and all of the related underlying theory. So I've had the privilege, I guess, of delivering these lectures at Oxford University. Most recently, I think the biggest one that I've done this year was at the European Parliament to inform them about what these issues mean coming into Europe, and that was very well received, maybe surprisingly. So that's enough about me. I want to talk about words, because that's mostly what I do, is decode words. For example, in the previous presentation, with all due respect, since she stepped out, we heard a lot about the diverse student. What is a diverse student? I understand a diverse population because it means that there are different people that come from different backgrounds or whatever, but I don't understand what a diverse individual is. So we have to start digging into what these words mean, because we use them very casually. I will begin by pointing out, while talking about words, that the 14th Amendment, so far as legal exposure in your future goes, the 14th Amendment contains an equal protection clause, but does not contain an equitable protection clause, and equal and equitable are not the same word. And that's probably important to remember going forward, because when we look at the definition of equity, and I was speaking with the Attorney General's office from the state of Missouri the other day about this, and he was quite, not the AG himself, but one of his assistant attorneys was very alarmed to find this out. I asked him, do you know the definition of equity itself? This definition is rooted in the academic literature, in fact, in the field of public administration, where it was adopted in the 1960s, late 1960s, to accompany the 2 priorities of public administration up to that time had been efficiency and economy, make sure that what we implement is efficient and that it's economical. So those are the 2 variables they were optimizing across, and they said they needed to add a 3rd variable, which was called equity, or social equity is the longer name for it. It was outlined by a researcher named George Fredrickson, and he wrote a review of this in the early 1980s that I draw this definition from, and I've adapted the definition. His statement was, to make it clear so I don't misquote George Fredrickson, was, where equality means that citizens A and B are equal, equity means that shares are adjusted so that citizens A and B are made equal. So in other words, equity is an administered political economy in which shares are adjusted so that citizens are made equal. That happens to be, coincidentally, the same definition as socialism. It is an administered political economy in which shares are adjusted so that citizens are made equal. Now, everything we saw on the slides previously said that equity had to be integrated into virtually everything. Diversity, equity, and inclusion is the thing on the board. And we have to face the fact that in the relevant context, we're not talking about how your stocks are doing with equity. We're talking about social equity, which is a pillar now of public administration, which is to redistribute shares so that diverse individuals are treated so that they are made equal. And so then we get some insight into what a diverse individual might be. It is somebody who is meant to receive the fruits of equity, which is a redistribution of shares. So if you don't know the definitions that we're working with, it becomes very difficult to deal with what we're being confronted with. But the fact of the matter is, equity violates the 14th Amendment. That's coming. People are figuring it out. Equity violates the 14th Amendment, and the lawsuits will come. The reason the lawsuits have not come yet is because of a number of Supreme Court cases, jurisprudence that was done in 1971, Griggs versus Duke Power, 1978, Bakke versus the Board of Regents of the State of California, and 2003, Grutter versus Bollinger, which was a U of M case, Michigan. And it turns out that the last two of those just got challenged by the so-called Harvard and UNC discrimination cases that the senator, I think, was referencing. Asian Americans in particular were being systematically discriminated against. It's arguable that white students were also being systematically discriminated against in college admissions, which overturns those conclusions, or some of those conclusions, in both Bakke and Grutter. It's not clear what the fallout of that will be. There are people looking into employment law as well. This isn't specifically about that, but that will end up challenging the Griggs versus Duke Power decision as well eventually in whichever court that ends up landing in. And so this understanding of what equity actually is and where it came from is going to come to light. And again, I remind you, the 14th Amendment does not contain an equitable protection clause, and nowhere in our Constitution, nowhere fully amended, does it mention that we should redistribute shares to make citizens equal. What does redistributing shares to make citizens equal look like? Well, we can look at, for example, one of the leading anti-racist, as he calls himself, scholars, Ibram Kendi, who's in a bit of trouble now himself for his institution at Boston University, which was meant to advance anti-racist equity. And Ibram Kendi, in his book, How to Be an Anti-Racist, it's on page 19 in the original first edition if you want to look it up, he says that the only remedy to racist discrimination is anti-racist discrimination. The only remedy to past discrimination is present discrimination, and the only remedy to present discrimination is future discrimination. That's an exact quote from the book, which has been changed in the new edition because it got him in some trouble. Because he admitted that creating equity, adjusting shares, requires discrimination. Because of the way that those three Supreme Court cases were decided, Griggs versus Duke Power said that if there is a disparate impact in population, let's say that an employer or an admission standard or whatever, that's completely neutral, at least on its face, ends up admitting people outside of the proportions of underlying society, that you can take that as de facto evidence of discrimination, even if you can't prove any intent to discriminate one way or another. So you can now say that an employer or an admissions body has been intentionally discriminating, even if they weren't intentionally discriminating, because of the facts of disparate impact. So that was the Griggs versus Duke Power. Bakke versus Board of Education said that there is actually an intrinsic educational, so this is more relevant to this body, an intrinsic value to education or benefit to education to have a diverse student body. So it talks about the farm boy from the rural community, and it talks about the urban youth, and it talks about black, and it talks about white, and it says that there's an intrinsic educational value to bringing diversity to the table. Now, what this translates into, after you go through Grutter versus Bollinger, where they said that you must have a critical mass of each identity category in order to have the benefits of diversity in an educational setting, to avoid further discrimination, to avoid tokenism, as it's referred to, is that you actually have to start establishing quota systems. But those quota systems are exactly what the court just struck down at Harvard and UNC, to which Harvard and UNC replied, we're going to figure out how to do it anyway, which seems to be in a bit of defiance of the court. So we're dealing with something that feels like it has a mandate above the law, a mandate above the court, that happens to share a definition with socialism, that happens to also be in virtually all of our institutions. But we can start to peel back the layers of understanding of these words. If equity is socialism, what are diversity and inclusion? Well, diversity clearly must mean something to do with who gets to benefit from the redistribution of shares. If we go back to Ibram Kendi, in 2019, he was asked to write a piece for Politico magazine. It's a whopping 1 paragraph long, so it'll take you no time to read it, where the question of the day was how to solve inequality. And he explained that to solve inequality, we needed a federal Department of Anti-Racism and a lot of other things that look very much like a dictatorship of the proletariat. because it can override federal, state, and local level policies by committee. But he says that that committee will be created and constituted of not political appointees, but as he says, people who are experts in diversity. Now, I thought diversity meant that there is a mixture of different backgrounds. What in the world is an expert in diversity? Well, I would submit to you, having read the literature from the critical and cultural Marxist background, starting in the 1960s in particular, that an expert in diversity is somebody who contains or who has what they refer to as a critical consciousness of their identity. A critical consciousness is the extension in critical Marxism of Marx's original idea of class consciousness, that you're aware of your status, what they call in intersectional language, your positionality, where you stand within society based upon whether you are in the bourgeois favored group or whether you're in the oppressed, less privileged group. And you understand more so that not only are you in that group, if you are in one of the oppressed groups, that you also are what they call a historical change agent. In other words, you're somebody who is meant to band together with other people in your group in solidarity to overthrow the existing system or to seize the means of production of the existing system so that you can end the oppressive dynamic that they identify as the root cause. They call it either material or structural determinism, depending on the circumstances. So an expert in diversity, I submit to you, is somebody who has or maybe doesn't have a particular identity feature. Maybe it's race, maybe it's sex, maybe it's sexuality. Gender identity doesn't exist, so I won't even mention that one. That's a fiction. You can't find a gender identity on somebody. It's a set of behaviors, which means it's actions. It's not who you are. But at any rate, you have somebody who occupies a certain identity category who believes certain things about it. So an expert in diversity, which is what counts as a diverse individual, isn't just a recipient of equity, it's also somebody who can advance the cause of the redistribution of shares of equity. Now, under the Soviet system, which implemented socialism, not equity, to be fair, these people were called commissars. And so your diversity officers in your universities are there to enforce the thing that is going to be identified eventually as in violation of the 14th Amendment if the Constitution of this land stands. If the Constitution falls, then it won't really matter. But if the Constitution stands, that they're the people that are there to enforce the violation of the 14th Amendment and make sure all departments, all students, all activities are compliant with that. But this brings us to the question of what the word inclusion means. We want to have an inclusive space. I talked a year and a half, 2 years ago with President Joe Harris at University of Oklahoma, and I talked to him exactly like I'm talking to you about what DEI means, and he said he hears me and he understands all that, and then he said, well, we just want to create an environment or a campus where everybody feels like they belong. That's what he said back to me. We just want a campus where everybody feels like they belong. Well, when we go through the lens of intrinsic power dynamics shaping society, in other words, if we understand this through the critical consciousness that I say is at the root of diversity, and I can tell you why they switched from economics to cultural issues if we have time. When we get to the root of that, a place where everybody feels like they belong is a place where there are no assertions of these power dynamics that take the people who would be classified as diverse individuals, the recipients of equity. There's nothing there that causes them to feel excluded. But what causes them to feel excluded is the power dynamic itself. It's not whether there are neutral facilities, it's whether there are accommodating facilities, affirming facilities, celebrating facilities, participatory facilities. In fact, it's the exact opposite of a neutral facility. It has to be an affirming facility that gives them the ability to never feel like they're excluded by virtue of any of these so-called power dynamics that have got supercharged by bad decisions on civil rights law by the Supreme Court, which I've named. What that means is that in practice, inclusion, as the senator mentioned that he identifies DEI, that the E should be exclusion, feels an awful lot like exclusion because it is in fact excluding everything that is possible or identifiable as generative of the power dynamics of systemic racism, transphobia, homophobia, so on and so forth. That in practice can include individuals who have in the past or are currently saying things that certain people that identify as diverse don't like, which superpowers those people to take offense at whatever they want and have an enormous amount of power over an institution. On the University of Wisconsin at Madison campus, it included a rock because the rock was identified as having been called by a racist name 100 years earlier in a newspaper article. And so the rock had to be removed at an expense of $60,000 to the university from the university itself, because somebody might find that story out and find that it is oppressing them. It's a rock. I mean, I've had a rock on me one time and it was oppressive, but this isn't what they're talking about. Inclusion is the justification for the censorship and purge of people and viewpoints that disagree with the diversity in the equity program. Where does this idea come from, though? The answer is actually Mao Zedong. The cultural and critical Marxists in the 1960s, who I referenced, Herbert Marcuse, for example, were fans of Mao Zedong. Mao Zedong ran a formula that he brags about openly in his 1957 speech titled On the Correct Handling of Contradictions Among the People, where he says that his formula that he used to transform China was called unity, criticism, unity. You start by creating a desire for unity, he said. You know, we just want a campus where everybody feels like they belong. And then you use criticism and struggle on the people who prevent that unity from manifesting. Through criticism and struggle, he says you can learn the proper meanings of right and wrong beliefs and behaviors, but he also defines those earlier in his speech. Those who support socialism are people, those who do not support socialism are enemies of the people, and you see who the sides of right and wrong are. So people who support the DEI initiative count as people who want to create unity or belonging, and people who don't support it are not. So this is straight political test. Do you agree with the equity, aka socialism program, or do you not? And then on the other side of this, what Mao said is that you end up with unity on a new basis, a new unity on a new basis. And that new unity on a new basis, the basis he defined it would be, in his words, socialist discipline, because he said there will be no freedom without discipline, just like there's no democracy without centralism. That's his quote. So it will be managed by an administering body that operates under what's called democratic centralism to enforce socialist discipline, such that the people who are in agreement with his program of building socialism, this is Mao in the 1950s, are considered the people, and the people who do not agree are considered enemies of the people, who receive the full weight of the dictatorship of the people pressed upon them. And what does Mao say that that includes? He doesn't go out and say that there's going to be beatings or public humiliations and shamings, which is what happened in practice, but what he does say in the speech is what will happen is we'll revoke their right to vote, we'll revoke their right to speak, we'll revoke their right to participate in civic life, he says, for a time. Well, the time is defined as until they change their minds and get on the program. And so the beating heart of the DEI initiatives that sound so pleasant and sound so nice is actually Maoist insurgency, which explains why a lot of the things that we see happening and feel happening around us in our society feel very much like a cultural revolution, because it's the exact same unity, criticism, unity basis for a cultural revolution that Mao Zedong successfully used from 1966 to 1976. Mao, of course, targeted young people in his revolutionary colleges and high schools primarily. He used those institutions to radicalize what he called a Red Guard. Now, of course, I just want to give a moment of pity for our woke students, because they are victims of this ideology in the most profound sense. They're not only being cheated out of an education in favor of these diversity things, they are in critical consciousness awakening, or wokening, if you will, conscientization in the literature. They're not only being cheated out of their education, they're being put at severe risk. Mao used these institutions and this formula to create his Red Guard, which was famously empowered to go bully and destroy property and attack police and do whatever it wanted to. And he unleashed them in 1966 to regain power after he'd been deposed. It turns out in '58 he launched a thing called the Great Leap Forward, not the Great Reset, it's a different thing. And the Great Leap Forward ended up killing maybe as many as 100 million people, destroyed the economy of China utterly, complete devastation, so bad that they removed Mao from power, even though he was the dictator, and replaced him with a man named Liu Shaoqi. And Liu Shaoqi held the presidency, or the chairman of the CCP, from 62 to 66, 67, and the Red Guard went around bullying and humiliating, destroying property, destroying all of old culture, tearing down statues of Christopher Columbus and Thomas Jefferson or somebody like that, and if you allow me some flourish, and they eventually in 1967 cornered Liu Shaoqi, hauled him out of the presidential palace, humiliated him, standing in front of a crowd of kids waving the little red book, and he pleaded with them and he said, "Am I not a citizen?" He was president of the CCP. Am I not a citizen? Can I not speak? And they said, no, you're not. You're an enemy of the people. And so they sent him off to die in misery in the countryside, which he did a few months later. And Mao took over in power. And right after Mao took over in power, this was October, November 1967, by the beginning of 1968, he decided that the Red Guard had become too radical and too far left, so he unleashed his People's Liberation Army on it and got rid of them. So millions of them were herded off to the countryside to die or killed outright. And that, unfortunately, is how socialism works, because as Mao also explained in this speech in 57 that he gave, there are different needs at different phases of the revolution. You need a destabilizing phase, but then you need the phase of building socialism. And I unfortunately identify all of the DEI initiatives that we have happening in colleges and universities, high schools, kindergartens, and workplaces as being part and parcel with this. I'm supposed to give some comments on how in the world this has taken over our country, how in the world this has crept into our education at all levels, how in the world this has taken over our corporations. The answer for corporations is actually less hard to answer, but gratefully, the previous speaker also gave us the answer to the educational institutions. So it took over corporations in a rather direct manner. Starting in 2003, a man named James Gifford at the United Nations concocted a plan to use all of the passive income that people have, or the passive investments that people have placed in their long-term financial retirement accounts, like pensions and so on. He found a way to do impact investing with that reservoir of roughly $6 or so trillion of money. So if you have your money in stocks, you can choose to move your money around to support green companies or to support, some kind of whatever social causes the companies, advertise, and you can do what's called impact investing that way. You can choose to build your portfolio that way. But here we have these people who just have their pension funds, their 401ks, and so on that are sitting there, and there's over $6 trillion in that, and it's not going to any causes because it's other people's money. So they devised a program at the United Nations, like I said, in 2003, that came in 2005 or 6 to be called ESG, Environmental, Social, and Governance Scoring of Long-Term Investment Prospects. Well, the S in ESG originally stood for Corporate Social Responsibility, but it now stands for DEI. It is the social program has morphed over the intervening years to be implement DEI according to the DEI standards that we have. An example of how this works in practice is everybody saw Dylan Mulvaney's face on a beer can, and we saw what happened with the result to Bud Light. But the question that didn't get asked nearly firmly enough is why on earth did they make the decision to put Dylan Mulvaney on a beer can in the first place? Well, it turns out that every corporation that's big enough that's signed up for it is scored by the Human Rights Campaign, which is a nonprofit. Why it has any power over our corporations is unclear, except that it gives this number called a Corporate Equality Index score. You probably are aware that there are healthcare equality index scores, there are municipal equality index scores, your municipality probably has one, and there's a state equality index score, and your state definitely has one. The HRC assigns these scores in order to leverage the results that it wants. Now, it's a LGBTQ organization at this point. It's no longer a gay civil rights organization. And their CEI demands require, among other things, it's not just workplace non-discrimination policies and all of these kinds of very basic things. It also includes participating in activism, lobbying, and visibility initiatives. So it's plausible, given that the reaction from the HRC after the Dylan Mulvaney beer can explosion, the boycott of Bud Light happened, the HRC came out and said, if you don't back Dylan Mulvaney completely, we'll lower your CEI score to Anheuser-Busch. Since that's the case, we can probably surmise that they were suggested that it would be good to increase trans visibility as a large-scale initiative this year if they want to maintain their perfect 100 CEI score. Well, why would they care about having a perfect 100 CEI scores? Because it's part of the proxy for their S score and their ESG scoring. And if they lose their ESG scoring, they lose their access to short-term lines of capital, and they can't run their business. You can't borrow $100 million in the short term to make a lot of beer during grain season if you can't gain access to capital. Your interest rates go up. You might get delisted from their ESG portfolios. People won't buy your stocks or run on your, there's all kinds of levers. Why corporations took this up is not that mysterious. But we saw on the last slide from the previous speaker, one of the last slides, that one of the reasons that we should care about DEI in education is because corporations that will hire people require DEI, but they require DEI because of this corrupt ESG system that is leveraging over everybody in a very much kind of a, I don't know, Soviet sort of style, if you ask me. You have a, Soviet means committee, by the way. There's a committee that decides what is the right and wrong ways to behave, the science of right human relations, you might call it, and they apply that to everything, just like the commissars would have. This is what I think has caused the corporations, but we also saw something else in the previous presentation, which was that the accrediting bodies and the athletic bodies require it. I don't know why the NCAA is deciding what our colleges and universities have to do in terms of its administrative and its academic activities, but the NCAA apparently has a lot of power over that. Our accrediting bodies, we saw literally the extortion racket put on the screen, which was that you can't transfer your credits, you won't be able to get into certain kinds of institutions, and you won't be able to get certain kinds of jobs if you're not accredited. Well, who gets to decide what the accreditation contains? Whoever controls the licensure, the accreditation, the credential in general controls what's going on. And if those entities, the American Bar Association was mentioned, the Nursing Association, if those happen to have been captured and corrupted from within, say by ESG or other mechanisms, institutional creep, the long march through the institutions, which was laid out as part of the exact same plan by the exact same people that I've already mentioned in the 1960s, if those things have been captured and they control the credentials, which are effectively a monopoly, then what looks like, well, we're just serving what the greater employment prospects look like, we're just serving what the accreditors want, is actually a corrupt system as well, which I urge you again to remember is exactly how communism implements itself. It's exactly the Soviet model, is that a central deciding committee decides how all of the governing institutions will work, and the governing institutions decide how everything under those will also work. And at this point, I feel like it's just important to remind you that understanding what these words mean is therefore absolutely crucial to understanding what their implementation is. But don't they mean something else? Couldn't it just mean something nice? Couldn't it just mean that clearly, you know, they said that we're going to have an increasingly diverse population? There's a previous speaker said that, and in fact, the previous speaker said that the increasingly diverse population we have to see reflected in hiring and admissions. She said, in fact, that we don't see parity. We don't see population parity in nursing for men or education. We don't see population parity in engineering for women. How is that supposed to be achieved without a quota? How exactly is it supposed to be achieved that we force the population to adjust shares to make all citizens equal without a quota? Well, here's how equity works in practice. Equity is said to be a measurement of equality of access. This is what they tell you. It turns out it's not a measurement of quality of access because they measure access by outcomes, just like you saw with the Griggs versus Duke Power decision, which empowers all of this from 1971. If there are disparate outcomes, there must have been disparate access, even if you can't find proof of disparate access. That's the logic of equity. So it's a circle. It's circular logic. If you don't have parity in nursing between men and women, if you don't have parity in engineering between men and women, if you don't have population parity across all of the different diverse groups, which clearly actually meant not straight white people, if you don't have that, then certainly there must be something wrong with the access, and so the solution is to implement more of the program, to demand that it's integrated at all levels in the education and the administration and the accrediting and so on, until you force the outcome to be what you want by fooling around with the access point, which you are claiming must have a problem because you're measuring the outcome, ignoring all other potential variables for why there might be differences in these outcomes. Interest, talent, lots of different things. Cultural issues, the overwhelming variable, to just put it completely flatly for professional and academic success, the overwhelming variable, which nobody's allowed to talk about, is having a stable home with two parents. It washes out every other variable. Having a stable neighborhood environment is the next biggest variable. That's it. There's no mention of sex, there's no mention of race, there's no mention of sexuality necessary. Having a stable two-parent home is the overwhelming variable in whatever studies that can be allowed to be published on this. So I urge you to before I stand for questions, I urge you to realize what we're dealing with. Equity means socialism. Diversity and inclusion are the implementation of that program, and the solution to all problems that can be identified through disparate outcomes is to apply more of them. This is the system that they've established. This is what our states are caught in, and I'm telling you, either the Constitution will fall and we lose our country, but if our country survives, the 14th Amendment lawsuits that are going to crush all of this and cause massive damages to be owed are all coming. And so the legal exposure, these Supreme Court cases have created a pressure of legal exposure, a legal liability field pointing in one direction. And as we start to finally decode what these words mean, that's going to start pointing in the other direction, depending on a few crucial Supreme Court cases, like we just saw one that struck down 2 of these bad decisions. So thank you, and I'll take questions if you want.
Senator Standridge, do you have questions for the presenter or members of the committee?
I'll see if any members of the committee have a question.
Seeing no questions, Senator Standridge, you're recognized.
Thank you. Dr. Lindsay, I have just a quick clarification on the the exclusion, which I think it clearly is, especially based on your explanation. I want to draw the analogy to athletics again, and I tried to do that, Chancellor Garrett, and maybe I didn't make it clear, and she's not here, so I'm not going to be critical of that, but the analogy I was trying to draw is, I played athletics through school. Never once did I think that my race entered into it, but there's no question that on the University of Oklahoma campus, the football team, the basketball team are not the same diversity in the basic population. Why are we picking engineering? And I'm not proposing that we go in and fire black athletes. I mean, I suggest that the best athletes in the state and the country are on our football team so we can win a national championship. Why are DEI people not raising Cain? We have too many, as we saw in the Supreme Court case, we have too many Asian Americans in engineering, right? We have too many of them in law and too many of them in medicine, so let's get rid of them. They're tipping the scale. Why can we not say we have too many people of color in sports? I mean, it's ludicrous to suggest that. I sound foolish saying it. But why does DEI only stop when it reaches certain things? They want to make sure they don't have straight white men, I guess, in engineering. There's too many of them, or Asians, or whatever. The population doesn't fit their mold. But why do they stop at athletics? Why aren't they out on the football field demanding that these players get kicked off because it doesn't represent the basic pool? I'd love to, obviously there's a bit of facetiousness there, but I'd like to understand why DEI only targets certain areas and certain groups of people.
So with all due respect, Senator, it doesn't only target certain areas, but it does target certain people. For example, within the field of athletics, you will notice, and I know that Oklahoma's been a battleground for this, that men are allowed to participate in women's sports in many places. So women are expected to step aside and make room for men in their locker rooms, in their private spaces, and in their sports where they're, not surprisingly, dominating. As my friend Riley Gaines points out, absolutely mediocre male athletes are stepping into women's sports and being national leaders in every division, every possible, I don't know exactly what they're called, sport, so every race, right? So from the 1 mile swim down to the 100-meter swim or 200-meter swim, you have somebody who's ranked in the 500-ish range in the male side, able to be in first in all of those categories, which nobody's first in more than like 1 or 2 categories ever. And so it's not that athletics is immune, it's that everything is to be understood in terms of the critical consciousness that I mentioned. Diversity means having been awoken to a critical consciousness. And so diversity has precious little to do with your skin color, with your sexuality. It nominally has something to do with those. We can take the example of Larry Elder when he ran for governor of California, was heralded on as the black face of white supremacy because he didn't have a critical consciousness. It had nothing to do with his skin color. We saw Pete Buttigieg, who happens to be sort of leftist, Secretary Buttigieg, if we should, when he was running for president in the Democratic primary in 2020, he was labeled as an inauthentic gay voice because he dressed in suits and passed as a straight person. So it has precious little to do with sexuality as well. What it has to do with is that the critical Marxist interpretation of our society is that certain groups have established themselves as the oppressor class or the superior class. They have granted themselves access to a form of bourgeois cultural property. In critical race theory, that property is whiteness. There's a paper from 1993 titled Whiteness as Property that makes it explicit. In queer theory, which has to do with all of the gender and sexuality stuff, that form of property is normalcy. So people have declared themselves normal so that they could say that other people, like trans people, are abnormal, and then they can be excluded from full participation in society under slogans like trans women are women. And what has to be overturned is that particular set of power dynamics. So if you had, for example, a football team that happened to be 60-70% white kids, even though they're the best players, while you might see the coach put up a fight about this and it might proceed, what you will actually find is that there will be an insufficiency of diversity on the team. You actually can see this. This happened a few years ago where a few NBA teams, you had the NBA team owners were no longer allowed to be called owners because it would remind the black players on the team of slaves. And the multi-million-dollar making black athletes on NBA teams were compared to slaves. This also is echoed repeatedly. This is, I think, in fact, a primary line by Colin Kaepernick about what it's like to play in the NFL, is that the black players are slaves. Of course, they're fairly handsomely paid and celebrated slaves, but nonetheless, this is the word that is used because it's not about identity and it's not about domains. It's about anywhere there is a power dynamic that favors the groups that have access to the so-called bourgeois properties, whether that's actual capital allocation. Here's an example. Dave Chappelle made jokes about trans people very famously in one of his specials, and he was accused of making his jokes from his position, I make this up not at all, of white privilege. And when pressed on how Dave Chappelle, who is a black man, has white privilege to make jokes about trans people, which doesn't make sense in the first place, the answer was because he has a lot of money. So it could actually be wealth, which is old school socialism, but it could be access to whiteness, normalcy, patriarchy, and misogyny. Depends on the dimension of the critical Marxist identity politics. But the goal is to overthrow those things, those dynamics by interrupting them and disrupting them, enforcing equity through them. And so in a sense, there are already these defined categories. You asked the question about Asians, on the other hand, though. Asians have been defined as white adjacent because of their overwhelming success. In fact, they're more successful on average in most metrics than white people are in our country. So they're now white adjacent, or they've received the benefits of whiteness, or they exhibit the characteristics of a model minority. There's all of these very disparaging terms for them under the DEI literature. But the point is that everything is to be understood in terms of these cartoonishly simple, unrealistic power dynamics that are all analyzed through a Marxist lens applied to cultural issues. And the goal, as Karl Marx said in the Communist Manifesto, is to abolish private property or abolish bourgeois property. So this is why critical race theory openly says abolish whiteness. This is why queer theory openly says abolish normal, abolish norms. In fact, the definition of queer in queer theory from David Halperin is that which is intrinsically opposed to anything that is considered normal, legitimate, or dominant. It's just it's an identity defined in terms of opposition to dominance in society. So the point is that you will find these initiatives playing anywhere there is a Marxist dynamic built off of one of these identity categories, which, because they have historical precedent in the kind of Marxist language, they are historical categories. They can't simply, like if the demographics change, they don't simply change. A historically underrepresented group is historically underrepresented, so it's underrepresented always in the historical sense. These are permanent categories designed to facilitate division and revolution.
Thank you.
Will there be any additional questions? Seeing none, Dr. Lindsay, thank you very much for your time. Senator Standridge.
Thank you, Dr. Lindsay. Mr. Chairman, I think, yeah, there we have Mr. Shapiro. Our next speaker, and everybody, again, should have his bio, so I don't want to do him a disservice by not reading it all, but Mr. Shapiro is a highly accomplished legal scholar. I think one of his most impressive accomplishments is a 500 amicus curiae as friend of the court, the Supreme Court. I just don't know how you would find the time. That is amazing. But Mr. Shapiro is here to enlighten us from a legal perspective. And Mr. Shapiro, if you wouldn't mind sharing a few other noteworthy things about yourself, and you're recognized, sir, to, if it's okay, Mr. Chairman, to enlighten us. Thank you.
Well, thanks very much, Senator Standridge and Chairman Pugh and distinguished members. Thanks for this chance to share my thoughts about DEI on campus. I have filed more than 500 amicus briefs in the Supreme Court. I haven't written them. I have a great team. I haven't written them all, at least. So it's a great team of lawyers that I've had the opportunity to work with in my career to do so. I think what you're doing here, given what we've seen on campuses across the country in the last 10 days, this topic could not be timelier, because there's a clear through arrow from this poisonous radical ideology that Dr. Lindsay just talked about to the support, justification, and celebration of the barbarism that we've seen perpetrated against Israel. Now, I'm the director of constitutional studies at the Manhattan Institute. Previous to that, I was briefly at Georgetown, which I'll talk about. That's part of this discussion. And before that, I was nearly 15 years at the Cato Institute. I'm also a longtime First Amendment advocate, and more recently had a lived experience, as they say, with how DEI undermines not just free speech, but the basic values of open inquiry that have been foundational to higher education from its inception. About a year and a half ago, I had my most direct and acute exposure to an academic culture that's hostile to civil discourse and learning. Indeed, shut up was the response, in more obscene terms that I won't repeat here, that I got from students at UC Hastings Law School when I tried to speak about my book on the politics of judicial nominations, which had become even more timely with Justice Breyer's retirement. They prevented the event from taking place. It was surreal. They were chanting and banging like it was an Occupy Wall Street meeting, applying a bad faith lens to a tweet in which I criticized President Biden for limiting his pool of Supreme Court candidates by race and sex. Activists called me racist and my expertise illegitimate. Now, I could have phrased the tweet better, for sure, but its meaning was clear, that Biden should have considered all possible nominees, as 76% of Americans agreed in a poll conducted by that right-wing outlet ABC News. Nevertheless, I was suspended from my new position as executive director of Georgetown's Center for the Constitution, pending investigation into whether my tweet violated university policies on harassment and discrimination. Now, those who shut down my event wanted to hear neither my reasoning about the president's Supreme Court criteria nor my analysis of the confirmation battle to come. And they castigated their own law school for allowing me to speak, and called for a committee of diverse student representatives to approve speakers, among other demands about mandatory training in critical race theory for students and faculty. Never mind that Hastings, as a public institution, would be violating the First Amendment if it disapproved speakers based on the content of their speech. Or actually, I shouldn't call it Hastings anymore because it's been renamed. It turns out its founder had done things that were considered politically incorrect in the 21st century. But never mind that, and as one of their deans advised the protesters in the few minutes when they weren't chanting and banging, not allowing a duly invited speaker to speak went against school rules. That's not surprising. Most universities, almost all of them, have policies that distinguish between protest and disruption. As the school's chancellor pointed out in a campus-wide email the next day, quote, disrupting an event to prevent a speaker from being heard is a violation of our policies and norms, including the Code of Student Conduct and Discipline, which the college will, indeed must, enforce. But it wasn't enforced, and nobody was disciplined. Now, you'd think that law students should have a greater appreciation for open engagement with provocative ideas than undergrads. After all, lawyers face much more difficult situations in their career than bad tweets. But my experience was no isolated incident, not even for that 1 month of March of 2022. The following week, a similar thing happened at Yale over a panel bringing together lawyers from left and right who agreed on little except the importance of free speech. Dean Heather Gerken buried her head in the sand. Then it happened again at Michigan when students obstructed a debate on Texas's heartbeat bill. Most famously, a year later, March of this year, Judge Kyle Duncan was shouted down at Stanford Law School by a mob egged on by the DEI dean there. The only thing that these events had in common was that non-progressive speakers were presenting ideas that some students found objectionable or offensive. We've gotten to a place where questioning affirmative action or abortion is outside the academic Overton window, the acceptable range of policy views. The trend of canceling speakers rather than challenging them also represents the loss of grace in our culture more broadly, the desire to ascribe malign motives to one's political enemies, an unwillingness to think of them as merely wrong rather than evil. As America has secularized, politics has replaced religion to fill our spiritual needs. And on campus, that means the postmodern identity politics of intersectional hierarchies and privilege Olympics and all of that gobbledygook, that power dynamics that Dr. Lindsay talked about. In that context, it's easy to see one's political opponents as heretics. And then, of course, their sacrilege isn't worth hearing. Now, as for me, after a 4-month investigation into that tweet, they paid some very high-powered lawyers in D.C. a lot of money to do this. But after 4 months, Georgetown reinstated me. After full consideration of the report I got from the Office of Institutional Diversity, Equity, and Affirmative Action, or IDEA, and on consultation with counsel and trusted advisors, especially my wife, who's a better lawyer than all of us, I concluded that remaining in my job would be untenable. Dean Bill Traynor cleared me on the technicality that I wasn't an employee when I tweeted. But IDEA, the diversity office, implicitly repealed Georgetown's speech and expression policy and set me up for discipline the next time that I transgressed progressive orthodoxy. IDEA speciously found that my tweet criticizing President Biden for limiting his pool of Supreme Court candidates by race and sex required, quote, appropriate corrective measures to address my objectively offensive comments and to prevent the recurrence of offensive conduct based on race, gender, and sex. Dean Traynor reiterated these concerns in a statement, further noting the, quote, harmful nature of my tweets. IDEA made clear that there is nothing objective about its standard. If I, quote, were to make another similar or more serious remark as a Georgetown employee, a hostile environment based on race, gender, and sex likely would be created. Any comment that anyone found offensive would have gotten me in trouble, such as opining that racial preferences in admissions are unconstitutional, as the Supreme Court held this past June. Instead of participating in that slow-motion firing, I resigned. The freedom to speak is no freedom at all if it makes an exception for speech someone doesn't like, or that offends some nebulous conception of equity. Georgetown applies even these so-called principles inconsistently. Contrast my case with the many examples of professors tweeting much worse things from the left, such as castrating white men who supported Justice Kavanaugh's confirmation, or justifying the mobs menacing justices' homes after the leak of the draft opinion in Dobbs. Because it's free speech for thee, not for me. Strong policies aren't enough if university leaders aren't willing to stand up to those who demand censorship. Proliferating DEI offices enforce an orthodoxy that stifles intellectual diversity, undermines equal opportunity, and excludes dissenting voices. Even the deans of elite law schools buck these commissars at their peril. What Georgetown subjected me to, what it would have subjected me to had I stayed, is, to mix metaphors, a heckler's veto that leads to a star chamber. My mantra became, live not by lies, the famous writing by Alexander Solzhenitsyn. I couldn't live that way, so I made a noisy exit, and I'm using this platform I've been given to shine a light on the rot in academia. A year ago, when Justice Thomas withdrew from a class he'd been teaching at George Washington University Law School, it was just one more example of the poisonous atmosphere in academia that makes it impossible to have a free exchange of ideas. GW administrators had admirably stood up to the mob, demanding that Justice Thomas be canceled for his vote to overturn Roe v. Wade, citing academic freedom guidelines correctly, but they had failed in instilling a culture of openness to ideas that challenge students' pre-existing conceptions and force them to grow. It's a shame that Thomas felt the need to withdraw, and a stark contrast to the announcement that the newly retired Justice Breyer would be teaching at Harvard. It's a shameless double standard. Now, I'm generally long on America. I'm generally an optimist. But we may have passed the point of no return in terms of the illiberal takeover of higher ed, which is particularly dangerous in law schools, which train the next generation of lawyers, who are the gatekeepers of our legal and political institutions. That's why this is particularly dangerous in law schools. The only thing probably more dangerous is in medical schools, where it's literally an issue of life and death. And I do mean illiberal. I want to make that clear. What we're seeing is not the decades-old complaint about liberal professors, the takeover of the faculty lounge at Berkeley by hippies in the 60s. I don't think the ideological ratio has changed all that much since I was in college 25 years ago or law school 20 years ago. Instead, what we have is a growing bureaucracy and weak administrators who placate the radical left. Now, what began as mere bureaucratic bloat, around 2010, schools started having more teaching staff than full-time faculty. And eventually, many began to have more administrators than students. I don't know what all they're administering, but there you have it. These have now exploded into vast DEI bureaucracies. A couple of years ago, there was a survey of the power conferences, the big football conferences. There were 5. It's consolidating into 2 now, or what have you. But anyway, the 65 large universities representing 16% of all students at 4-year institutions. And this survey found, using publicly available data, that the average school has more than 45 people devoted to DEI, which is more than the average number of history professors. DEI is the fastest growing segment of the educational bureaucracy, with staffs on average 4 times larger than those that provide legally mandated accommodations to students with disabilities. And I must be clear to clarify that the study was excluded people whose primary responsibility was in things like Title IX or equal employment opportunity or other legal obligations to comply with federal and state civil rights laws. This goes beyond that. This is the enforcement of this postmodern DEI ideology. These offices have broadened terms like harassment and discrimination, not to promote welcoming environments, but to enforce progressive ideology. They've also borrowed terms like harm and safety from behavioral psychology to shut down discussion of certain subjects altogether. And they have every bureaucratic incentive to do so. Just like in the public sector, bureaucrats have to justify their power and their budgets by addressing petty grievances in heavy-handed ways. The behavior of Stanford's DEI dean in egging on the mob against Judge Duncan was illustrative of how DEI regimes are antithetical to universities' basic missions of open inquiry. It's not that Tyrion Steinbach at Stanford somehow defied DEI teaching, went too far. She was a perfect example of where this leads. So I'm pessimistic that anything will change at any school where academic freedom and free speech aren't supported, where rules against hecklers' vetoes aren't followed. Too few administrators follow the example of the late University of Chicago president Bob Zimmer, who, in response to pressure to punish Professor Dorian Abbott for criticizing affirmative action, reaffirmed the university's commitment to faculty members' freedom, even to disagree with any university policy. Wherever deans and presidents stand up for free speech and the core truth-seeking mission of any academic institution, the mob disperses. But most university officials are spineless cowards. The problem is not that deans like Traynor and Gherkin are woke radicals. It's that they're careerist bureaucrats who are unwilling to confront the illiberal inmates who have taken over their institutions, including as fellow administrators in burgeoning DEI offices. Mere statements about academic freedom and declining to fire Supreme Court justices aren't enough. Schools have to affirmatively instill a culture of respect for opposing views and civil discourse. This means dismantling DEI bureaucracies that undermine the liberal values of free speech and due process and equal protection. And it means ending compelled speech or loyalty oaths in the form of diversity statements. University presidents, provosts, deans, they're very good at instilling whatever values they care about: public service, inclusion, social justice, entrepreneurship, whatever. they can do the same for civil discourse. I spoke at the University of Oklahoma Law School about a year ago, and it was standing room only. It was a discussion with a distinguished professor emeritus of constitutional law. The dean there, I think Dean Guzman was her name, was there the entire time. She was taking notes, and she came up to me afterwards and asked for suggestions. I mean, this is not rocket science. Your policies are generally all in place. You have to instill that culture at orientation in the materials that students and would-be students receive throughout the course of the year. Like I said, university leaders are very good at instilling whatever values they want. So free speech, equal opportunity, open inquiry, this should be part and parcel of it. A year ago, soon after I left Georgetown, I wasn't holding my breath at the prospect of reform. But perhaps now we're finally seeing a backlash to our illiberal inquisitors. I'm still not sure it can all be done from within. So we do need external control from state legislators like yourselves and attorneys general to enforce the rules. And I have model legislation about abolishing DEI bureaucracies, getting rid of diversity statements, getting rid of mandatory trainings, and not hiring or contracting based on identity characteristics. We can talk about that, if you will. Certainly a role for state legislators there, as well as federal congressional oversight tied to federal funding. And I think we also need exogenous shocks, external shocks from employers who might not want to hire people who either celebrate the mass murder of babies, as we've seen in the last week, or those who shout at federal judges, we hope that your daughters get raped. And so things like the judges' boycott against Yale and Stanford for clerkship hiring, I think that is a necessary corrective. And we need public exposure. For example, the day after the Wall Street Journal published John Saylor's expose of how Texas Tech used job applicants' diversity statements as ideological litmus tests for hiring faculty in, I think, the biology department. The day after that, the university announced that it would end this practice for faculty hiring. So in a lot of places, again, to mix metaphors, these are Potemkin villages guarded by paper tigers. So there's still a long way to go, I think, before universities return to their mission of seeking truth and knowledge, and law schools return to their goal of teaching future lawyers to uphold the rule of law. But the battle's been joined, and I'm heartened that you're having this study and you're considering legislation to start righting the ship. And I'm happy to answer what questions you might have.
Thank you, Mr. Shapiro. Members, will there be questions of the presenter? Senator Standridge, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Shapiro. I appreciate you being here. I have something that I just found this week. To me, I saved this question for you from your legal background, but this indoctrination piece really bugs me. All of it is just crazy, but I have parents and grandparents contact me all the time these days about the pressures on the students to do more than just get educated. And I had a student drop out of OU recently. His dad took him out because of some of the things that was going on. He's at UCO now and very happy, which is another university, maybe in the chairman's district. I'm not sure if that's yours. But anyway, that's just not appropriate. But anyway, I ran across this on some legal research. In Oklahoma, we don't have statutory authority to change people's biological sex, and I don't think we have the chromosomal method to do that, actually, scientifically. But yet, I have a paper in front of me where the University of Oklahoma's Student Legal Services Director, Tracy Langford, is filling out paperwork instead of doing all the other legal services that I assume the student body could use. She's filling out paperwork to change the biological sex of a student from, I don't know from which to which, but again, no statutory authority, no, I wonder if this is a violation of oath because without a chromosomal test, I'm not sure how she's coming to this conclusion that this is a a legal change. I mean, is this, don't you see this as a DEI, all of that coming down to where they're just doing so much other things besides just educating our kids, and it's driving a wedge? I mean, from a legal perspective, do you think that's the job of the Student Legal Services Director at OU?
Well, I'm certainly not familiar with Oklahoma law, so I can't opine specifically on whether there's a legal problem there. But what you've identified more broadly is certainly mission creep. And as we've grown these bureaucracies, they're the tail that wags the dog. Again, this is a different problem than whether faculty is too left-wing, or what kind of courses are approved for teaching to students, or what kind of courses are mandatory, or what professors are saying inside the classroom. There are issues with that, but that's different than, as you say, a legal services person or some other educational bureaucrat, a non-teaching staff member or administrator who is creating this culture and enforcing, indoctrinating an ideology in in assorted ways, very subtle sometimes, more blatant in others, that detracts absolutely from universities' educational missions. And again, I think university administrators should focus on helping the faculty administer the educational mission, as well as complying with federal and state laws, whether it relates to civil rights or accounting or what have you, and not get into this other extraneous stuff. So I agree with you there.
Follow up, Senator Standridge.
Thank you, Mr. Shapiro. Oklahoma, and I'd like to get with you and look at our funding authority, if you will, in Oklahoma, because I think it's difficult here in our state. Because I think funding, we've learned, sadly, I guess, that it controls so much of what our higher ed does. In fact, I won't ever forget a meeting a couple of years ago with some older men with very sharp knives that would not stop, cutting off perfectly healthy organs of young girls until we cut off their funding. It's diabolical and medieval, but I wonder here, we have a Board of Regents that gets that money and disperses it. I don't know if you've looked with your model legislation, if you looked at any other states to see if there's other states that you've seen that's like that, if you have an insight on how we could force this issue, because that may be the only way we'll be able to force it is with funding.
The Chronicle of Higher Education maintains a tracker of all anti-DEI legislation that's been introduced this year, and you can look at, I think we're up to 5 or 6 states that have passed something like 17 introduced something, and there probably will be more in next year's legislative sessions. A lot of states are part-time legislators and all that. So different states have adopted different aspects of this, but certainly funding is often the whole ballgame. When my model legislation talks about abolishing DEI bureaucracies, that means defunding them. That means saying there's no more provision for, it's not necessarily tied to having the magic words DEI in your title, but who are doing this work. And there are definitional issues there that you can tailor to your specific needs in Oklahoma. But certainly, if you're not funding a given office at a university, then that office will cease to exist. That's the biggest power that the legislative branch has, is the power of the purse.
Senator Daniels, you're recognized for a question.
Thank you, Mr. Shapiro. Very glad to have you here, even remotely. Go back to your conversation with the Dean of the University of Oklahoma Law School. You said that after your presentation, she came to you and wanted more ideas on how to implement and accomplish civil discourse within the law school. Is that correct? Yeah, she was there taking diligent notes the whole time during the event, and we had a nice conversation, very brief afterwards, saying, she just asked me, what other ideas do you have? And I said, look, as dean, you set culture, whether with your periodic emails, whether what kind of programs you run, not relying on student groups, but having the law school itself model what civil debate looks like,
as part of orientation programs, emphasizing the importance of freedom of speech and respecting different viewpoints and things like that.
Follow up.
You're recognized.
So in your view, was her inquiry based on a concern that civil discourse was eroding, or was her inquiry something that this was something new that she was considering, which would indicate to me that the decay of civil discourse was even worse than you thought it was, that the dean of a law school needed help in understanding how to have civil discourse in a university law school?
Well, I'm not going to speculate on what was inside her head, and I don't know enough about the culture or conditions at the university or at the law school more specifically, but I did see her coming up to me and asking me as being earnest and in good faith, but I don't know beyond that.
Follow up, Senator Daniels. She waves. Senator Standridge, you recognized?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Shapiro, you had mentioned your model legislation, and don't want to impose, but would you consider having your office send that out, and I'll make sure and distribute that to all of our Senate bodies so that maybe some that weren't able to attend the study can have a look at your model legislation, maybe something we might consider doing here in Oklahoma?
I think Suzanne Edwards already has it, so you should be able to get it.
Perfect. Thank you.
Members, will there be additional questions? Seeing none, Senator Standridge, you're done. Mr. Shapiro, thank you very much for joining us remotely, and appreciate it. And I'm assuming that Senator Standridge has your contact information. We won't distribute it too widely, but maybe just a little bit amongst the committee. So thank you for sharing with us today.
Thank you.
Senator Standridge, you are recognized to introduce the next presenter.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Our next presenter is no stranger to this building, Jonathan Small, who's the president of the Oklahoma Council of Public Affairs. I don't want to steal all of his information. Everybody knows Jonathan pretty well, but I would say that the crew at OCPA on this issue has just really done a fantastic job, Jonathan, and your team over there, between Brandon and all the folks over there, have just done a great job on trying to educate the public and this body on the seriousness of the issue. I mean, it's not just about drag shows. It's not just about the money. It's about the whole thing. It's about discrimination. It's about all of these things. So I'm glad you're here and willing to participate today, and appreciate your time. And if, again, you can share a little bit more about yourself, but tell us your perspective from DEI.
Thank you to the chairman and Senator Standridge for allowing us to speak. I want to make sure you guys have a little bit of information about my background first. So I actually worked in the Oklahoma City public school system from 1997 to 2003. I worked in schools that were 90+% minority students. So I had a front row seat to how some of the policies that are being talked about today actually have a negative impact on the students that they're supposedly to help. And then I also had the privilege of serving as an analyst in state government, and then later director of government affairs, and worked for both Republican and Democrat administrations, and then had the privilege of serving on the state's Affirmative Action Review Council for almost 3 years. So I want to talk about the real world experience that we have when we try some of these diversity inclusion programs that you've heard about. But before I start, I think it's really important that we ask a question that I know this committee has been challenging the state to ask, which is, what is the primary purpose of public higher education in Oklahoma? You know, you guys have done a really good job. This committee has done a really good job of saying the ultimate purpose of the billions of dollars that are being extracted out of Oklahomans' pockets at both K through 12 and higher ed It's for the purpose of preparing students with the skills necessary so that they can obtain jobs and build families, especially in those fields where there's the most need. And so I think that's really important. I appreciate the Chancellor for talking, but I want to clarify, and I know that the Senate's actually been working on this. I know it can be tempting to think that who you care about as lawmakers or who we care about as the public is Panasonic or Fortune 500 company. But it's important to remember that according to the Small Business Administration, 99.4% of the businesses in Oklahoma are small businesses. They're not publicly traded companies based in Asia. And so how we determine the workforce that taxpayers are going to produce and fund, it should be geared towards those small business-oriented needs in Oklahoma. And also those small businesses also have, even when you include all of the government-related employees, there are more people in Oklahoma who are employed in small businesses than are in large businesses. And I would submit to you that that large businesses don't have time to worry about quotas. They have time to worry about the needs of their customers. So I think it's really important. There's just really 3 areas that I want to try to cover, and then happy to take questions. And so that first one is, so how effective are affirmative action review and DEI related policies? And I thought it was really good that Dr. Lindsay talked about the, almost if you call it the hamster wheel. So if your definition of failure is the presence of your so-called inequity, you always fail and you can always pick apart the system. I witnessed that after agency after agency. So here's what would happen. You would have people who felt like state agency employment wasn't diverse enough. So you'd have a state agency come in. I would be sitting on the council. They would beat to death the state agency director about the fact that, hey, look at this demographic makeup of the state of Oklahoma. There's approximately 10 to 15% of Oklahomans are black, but yet only 2 to 3% of your employees are black. You're a racist, right? And so one of the interesting things that would happen is that I would ask questions. So I would ask questions about, okay, so tell me more about your applicant pool. And one of the things that we would find over and over and over again is that often where state agencies were accused of racism, the available applicant pool of the particular equitable race they wanted was 1 to 2%. I know a lot about this, and this is no offense to anyone. I'm just trying to be transparent with you. When I finished at the University of Central Oklahoma, I applied for a lot of jobs. So I'm happen to be black. As you can guess, my parents, they happen to be black as well. They were excited when I finished college. And there were all kinds of private sector companies that my parents wanted me to take a job from. I chose to take a job in state government. My parents were somewhat disappointed that I passed on the private sector employment. And so here's the purpose of that story. Given the fact that many racial demographics are a smaller pool of the population, they're often going to be, to use the left's term, underrepresented because they're a sought-after commodity somewhere else. That was the case for me. I had lots of job offers. I thought maybe I was interested in trying to lower taxes and help government work better, so that's why I chose a job in state government. Some people would say that I'm not doing a very good job. But I think the thing to remember is that even after Oklahoma's experience with affirmative action, we didn't achieve the results. So then people are asking, but why are we seeing failure and what are the challenges? I wish that the Chancellor would have shared with you the data that really matters. Last summer, the Chancellor shared the fact that just 6% of Oklahoma graduates were ready for STEM classes. If you happen to be one of the African-American children that is in Oklahoma City or Tulsa public schools, where often less than 5% of you are proficient in math and science or reading, you're not going to enroll in the College of Engineering at OU. Despite the fact that the faculty might gin you up and place steps on the sidewalk talking about the privilege walk to engineering. I didn't want to take a lot of time today to make sure people are aware, because I think there's some perception, some might think that the effort to discriminate against students isn't going on in Oklahoma higher education. It's alive and well. OSU right now is in the middle of litigation for essentially using a speech police and a code of conduct to discriminate against students. That's going on right now. Generally, OSU, people tend to think that, well, OSU is more conservative. They're not doing what OU is doing. OU recently has been involved in litigation for the volleyball coaches' efforts to attack the free speech rights of students. And in fact, the OU Board of Regents and their attorney of choice, Michael Burridge and the Burridge Law Firm, which is often used by David Boren and others to clean up things that they don't want taxpayers to see, referred to the volleyball player's advocacy of her free speech as, I quote, an inimical rant. So these are things that are going on right now in Oklahoma. I'm sad to say, I think I heard you talk about your friend transferred to UCO. UCO was actually on the forefront of many of the so-called gender studies and other advocacy efforts. So these efforts are happening in Oklahoma colleges. It's not something that's far off in California. I encourage you to go to our website. It'll depress you because we have lots of examples of where this is going on with taxpayer dollars. And so I know you guys are worried about, so what are solutions? How do we fix the problem? There's really three things we propose. And we want to applaud the legislature today. It was earlier mentioned about the power of the purse. There's one thing higher ed responds to, and it's actually typically the one thing that all government entities responds to, and that's if you take their money. And this legislature has shown that they've had great success, that when higher ed won't get the message, if they remove funding, higher ed starts to behave in a manner that's more befitting of the billions of dollars that it's getting with taxpayer dollars. Kudos to the legislature for telling the university hospital system that you were not going to give them any of the federal funds if they continue to refer our children to be experimented on under the name of the so-called gender-affirming care. That activity would have continued to go on in that system if the legislature hadn't said you're not going to get future dollars that we had planned to give to you. I would also suggest something that has to take place, and that is, given the state's onerous constitutional requirement that effectively binds the hands of the people's representatives, wherein you have to essentially give a general appropriation to higher ed and just hope they do good with it. We suggest that it's time to move away from that system and move to what we're calling a workforce needs education scholarship fund that would be placed at the Department of Commerce, and then the legislature would annually decide how much money it wants to spend on building or producing the graduates with the degrees that the state feels like it needs. There is no constitutional provision that controls how the Department of Commerce spends its budget. That is ultimately up to the legislature. We would suggest that that's a far better way to make sure you get the engineers that the state of Oklahoma says it needs. An example of that, and I was glad that the Chancellor mentioned that their job is to produce the employees that we need. Well, let's talk about that for a minute. Annually, it's regularly discussed, and these are approximate numbers, but our higher ed institutions produce about 30,000 graduates. But yet our workforce tells us we need somewhere in the range of between 12 and 15,000 graduates in the STEM realm per year. Yet our higher education system continues to only produce somewhere between 5,000 and 6,000. So I would suggest to you that even with this focus on DEI, and I'm glad that the Chancellor exposed really the treason that's being committed by the accreditation agencies. And so I'm glad that she's actually helping spur you guys on that something needs to be done about really, should we even have higher education institutions that are more focused on accreditors that know nothing about the needs of Oklahoma, know nothing about the jobs that Oklahoma students need to have in the future? And then finally, I would just say that the legislature and the Senate's done an outstanding job on this. Continue to focus on pushing aggressive education reform at the K through 12 level. If you want to see more minorities and underrepresented people in STEM fields, they have to be able to read at grade level. They have to be able to pass sufficiently well the ACT and other math-related tests. That's the only way that you're really going to see an increase in the number of underrepresented people that are functioning well and producing well from our society. So with that, happy to take any questions.
Members, will there be questions? Senator Standridge, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Jonathan. Appreciate you being here. On the financial front, and I agree with you, I think we showed some strength on that issue. I was very proud of the legislature on that front. Do you know a way in the short term? I mean, you probably know the budget is not better than me or Julie, but some legislators. But do you know of a way in the short term, budgetarily, off the cuff, that we could rein in this? Is there some monies out there on the tree, so to speak, kind of like we did with the medical side, that we could impact that would be enough to cause OSU, OU, and whoever else is doing this to rein back?
Well, I think a great one is that I would just put higher ed back where they were 2 years ago. So they all essentially kind of gave you all the impression that if you gave them about $100 million a year, that particularly our flagship university wasn't going to raise tuition. I would just take all that back and start this workforce needs scholarship program. That's $100 million that could be prorated across the number of students who are interested in the various fields. I think it's also important, I was glad that the Chancellor admitted for us something that had been difficult for us to extract out of colleges and universities. By their own admission, they've spent approximately $84 million in the last decade on diversity, equity, inclusion. So I think that suggests that's another place, at least of $10 million a year, where the legislature could again reduce higher ed's budget and reappropriate it to better use in a place where you all can have oversight. And then OCPA has conducted studies about just the inefficiencies in higher ed as it relates to teaching loads. What we found by reviewing their own data is that, for example, at OSU, approximately 20% of the professors are doing nearly 50% of the teaching. And so if you just required professors to become more efficient, like the top 20%, at OSU, you're talking about saving students and taxpayers $80 million a year. At OSU, that number is even more dramatic. It's almost $99.5 million. So those are three areas where I could start today, and you could draft. I was on appropriations staff. I could draft for you an appropriations bill today that could redirect those dollars from higher ed if you would like me to.
Follow up, Senator Standridge.
Thank you, Jonathan. Well, you may just need to noodle this, but it seems like to me there might. So those are kind of what I think of as indirect. So you're, and the problem we have here is kind of the rural-urban issue. And so when you say you're going to take $150 million or whatever that figure is, for me in my district, it's definitely worth it, because OU is really, I think, causing more problems than good with all of this money they're spending on that. But will my colleague in the Panhandle or wherever else think the same with a small school that they think is free of this? Would you mind noodling and thinking about maybe these little pots of money, which we found with medical that they're scared of losing $500,000. I mean, they want every single penny they can get. If it's pennies to help them cut up kids, they'll take that. Or if it's pennies taken away if they don't, they respect that. So maybe see if you can find some, if you would consider looking to see if you can find some ancillary pots of money that we might be able to impact.
Well, so one of the things, I'm glad you mentioned that, and one of the things I want to make sure is clear, one of the beauties of a workforce needs scholarship fund is that any entity that provides the education could be a recipient of those dollars. So our more regional universities who have less resources to focus on racism and creating divisions, they would be able to add students. If you think about it, some of the schools that I'm more aware of, like Panhandle State, they've got a really good community.
Is that in Texas?
And so it's near it, but they are tending to focus on what are those core business and other science-related degrees that people need. So really, definitely OU and OSU would stand to lose in the system that we propose, but a number of the regional and smaller colleges have a great opportunity because they'd be willing to offer the degrees that the state needs. One of the failures of the current funding model in our higher education system is, so you'll hear that it's a per pupil funded system, but the reality is that's meaningless because by the nature of their size, OU and OSU are just going to get an outstanding amount of those dollars just by their ability to attract attendance regardless of the actual workforce needs of the state.
Senator Standridge, you recognized.
Sorry, Jonathan. Another question on that front then. So it sounds like you're pretty invested in that. That's the direction OCPA is pushing for, and that's correct.
We're open to other things too.
Well, but no, I want to stay on that for a second. Would you consider putting in your legislation, whoever you work with, just say simply that whoever gets this money cannot have, similar to the Texas legislation, they just simply can't have these programs, and there's $100 million that if they want to participate in that $100 million, then they just need to eradicate those areas in their faculty that are making that use of that money inefficient, for one thing. Would you consider adding that just as a
Yes, you would most definitely want to include that provision, and you could. This weakness in our Constitution is what makes it difficult for the legislature to stop the funding at the public universities, because once you send the money to the State Board of Regents, the university presidents know that they really don't have to listen to you. And they currently have a court system that would support them.
Will there be additional questions? Seeing no additional questions, Mr. Small, thank you very much for joining us today. Senator Standridge, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And thank you, Mr. Small. You had mentioned taking a quick break. Do you want to do that now, Mr. Chairman? If you need one, I'm good, but if you need one.
Members of the committee, we don't have to accommodate me, but does anybody else need a break? We'll press. Oh. Senator Standridge, you are recognized.
All right, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Next on the agenda, we have a panel, and I will introduce the moderator of the panel, if it's okay, Mr. Chairman, and allow him to introduce his members. We've seated the panel in these first four seats. Thank you, gentlemen, for being here. I would introduce Brian Norman, who's with the Goldwater Institute, and I'll just tell you, over the years, I've read much from the Goldwater Institute and Heritage, both the institutions that are be represented by these four great folks. And I tell you, the amount of good information and intellectual data that can be gained from just a few minutes with these folks or perusal of their website is just amazing. Not just Oklahoma, but all the states benefit from the brain trust that these groups have established. So, Mr. Chairman, I'd introduce to you Brian Norman, who's the Manager of Strategic Engagement at Goldwater Institute. And Brian, if you would please tell us a little bit more about yourself and then also introduce your colleagues here so we can start with this panel. And like we talked before, take your time. We've got time left in the study, but try to leave about 20 minutes or so at the end there in case folks have some questions.
Well, thank you, Senator, and thank you, Mr. Chairman. My name is Brian Norman. Like the Senator mentioned, I'm the Manager of Strategic Engagement at the Goldwater Institute. And essentially what that just means is I try to take the good work that these individuals do and place it in front of legislators and try to get it passed at the state level. So a bit about the Goldwater Institute. We're a public interest law firm and think tank that works in courtrooms, state legislators, and communities across the country to promote individual liberty and economic freedom. And a huge focus of ours is also educational choice and educational freedom. With me today, I have Matt Byenberg, who is our Director of Education Policy, Jonathan Butcher from the Heritage Foundation, also a senior fellow at the Goldwater Institute, so we still claim him, and Adam Kissel as well with the Heritage Foundation. I think we've heard a lot about the problems that universities are facing with diversity, equity, and inclusion, and the pervasiveness of this ideology across campuses. We believe that at the Goldwater Institute, we've come up with 4 solid reform ideas that are well thought out and bold solutions to this problem. And so just to get us started on that discussion, I'd like to turn it over to my colleague, Matt, so we can talk a little bit more about those solutions.
Thank you, Brian. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Members, for the record, Matt Byenberg, Director of Education Policy at the Goldwater Institute. Thank you very much for the time to speak with you. As Brian mentioned, obviously the previous speakers have spoken a lot about DEI. We've spent a lot of time focusing on what is DEI, and so I'd like to spend a little bit of time about what can be done about DEI. And to do that, I'd like to highlight some of the specific mechanisms that are being used to push DEI in the classroom here in Oklahoma and elsewhere, in elementary, secondary, and particularly higher education as well, and some of the specific legislative solutions that are available to bodies, including this one, to remedy that. So looking first at higher education, I think it's fair to say that nothing has a greater impact on the students than the actual substance of the instruction that's given to them, the actual course content that kids are receiving. That is the core, the centerpiece of a university experience. Unfortunately, proponents of DEI are also aware of this, and they have aggressively forced DEI into curricular programming. As you can see on the top of this first slide here, Oklahoma State University, for instance, requires all students to complete, as you see on the top there, all new students will complete a diversity or D course. This is a component of general education studies, which means that every student, as a condition of obtaining a degree from the university, is forced to spend time and tuition dollars on DEI-related courses. And echoing the substance of what you heard the speakers describe earlier, the university is very clear about what they mean by this. So as you see on this slide, these are the course elements that are expected to be part of these diversity courses. And as you can see here, this includes a focus on identity of underrepresented groups in present-day United States, in which, quote, students will critically analyze theories and systems of cultural, societal, political, or economic power. Now, you hear 2 of those same words Dr. Lindsay mentioned as well, identity and specifically power. That is to say, an emphasis on dividing or framing societies based upon group identities and judging them according to the power of that perceived group or identity. You will notice in contrast certain features that are absent here. You see nothing about diversity of thought, intellectual diversity, viewpoint diversity, anything about the marketplace of ideas. You'll also notice that the requirement explicitly says in present-day United States. This is not simply teaching students and making sure that we are presenting to them history, issues of slavery, Jim Crow, Native American issues. This is talking about the contemporary United States and attempting to frame the contemporary United States through this idea of existing current systemic racism. Unfortunately, the pressure to infuse DEI is not simply upon students, it also rests upon faculty. As Mr. Shapiro mentioned and others, this concept of diversity statements, which is used in Oklahoma and elsewhere to essentially screen out applicants. So prospective faculty who would like to become a member of the faculty are told not only do you need to submit a resume and a cover letter, but a statement pledging your allegiance to diversity, equity, and inclusion. And the rubrics that are used to then judge these have explicitly penalized applicants who say things like, well, I treat all students the same regardless of race. That is deemed to be a misunderstanding and unsatisfactory understanding of DEI. Now, turning to the next page, it's not simply these diversity statements that affect the faculty experience on university campuses. There are other tools that are used to help promote campus orthodoxy. Increasingly, faculty across the country are pressured to infuse DEI into their coursework and told that they need to diversify their curriculum. That is to say, replace the readings on their reading lists, no longer to choose them based upon the caliber of the work, but upon the race or gender of the author. Now, whether through formal mandates or through informal guidance and pressure, faculty are aware that universities who have power over what courses are ultimately listed know that the university holds the power to potentially look less favorably upon a class that does not follow such guidance. Now, as you see here, this is from the Center for Faculty Excellence at the University of Oklahoma. They describe decolonizing one's syllabus. Now, in fairness to the university, they do say that they themselves have chosen to use the language of diversification rather than decolonization, because in their words, decolonization would require much more than the simple process of diversifying one's readings, classroom examples, and images. Now, as many of you are aware from the recent events, the term decolonization has been closely related to promotion of violence, as we are seeing in the Middle East currently. So again, this is something that is increasingly common throughout higher education in the United States, this notion of diversifying a curriculum. So let's move to this slide. Now again, we hear a lot from the left and from those who support DEI that any attempt from those who have concerns about DEI to begin to rein in some of its reach in the curriculum or in content is trampling on academic freedom. We hear this a lot, that you can't touch this, the faculty of academic freedom. We at the Goldwater Institute are very strong proponents of free speech and academic freedom, and we believe that that is crucial to the mission of the university. However, occasionally, the folks who promote DEI say the quiet part out loud, as you see here, in which they explicitly say, this is from a law dean at Rutgers, sometimes diversity trumps academic freedom, which is to say they are happy to use and cite academic freedom as a cudgel against those who might say, we have concerns about the content you're forcing on kids or faculty, but they view it as little more than a speed bump when it's in the way of what they are actually trying to promote. So as you can see from that, these are not the only, I'll get to the next slide in just a moment, these still are not the only elements, and I'm going to move to the suite of policy reforms that we've put together to address these. But one more that I would like to touch on here, it's not simply an issue of what the course content is. I think this was alluded to by Mr. Small as well. Another element of imposing this campus orthodoxy in Oklahoma and elsewhere has to do with this idea of bias reporting systems. It was touched on briefly, which essentially give the universities, I'll pull this out, this is from, you can see Oklahoma State University, the organization, pro-free speech organization Speech First, which we have partnered with on model legislation that I'll describe, and also they're active in several lawsuits, have taken aim at these. These bias reporting systems, as you can see here, are used to track so-called bias incidents. Now, as the university defines the terms you can see on the bottom there, they define it as any actions committed against or directed toward a person or property motivated in whole or in part by a bias. So they're claiming that these are actions taken. You might think this is some sort of physical altercation or something that takes place. This is an action that's taken to make this an unsafe space. When you actually look at what qualifies as a bias incident, what you find that they encourage folks to solicit are comments made in class, comments on the internet or social media, incorrect name or pronoun usage. That is to say that while they say that they are trying to police action and violence, what they actually view is speech as harmful or violent, including using a pseudo-pronoun for a student or failing to do so. All this is to say that while the universities typically go to great lengths to argue these are not disciplinary or investigations conducted against students, these are simply a resource to help those who feel that they've been marginalized. If you look here, for instance, the University of Oklahoma's Division of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, in which they also solicit reports on bias, prejudice, behavior, or harmful speech, you see down there highlighted on the bottom, please identify the persons engaged in the behavior. They are explicitly calling on students to report by name the offenders. It's difficult to conceive of something that's going to chill speech more on a university campus than if a student or faculty member feels that they are under constant threat of reporting by peers or students for something as harmless as a comment in class or mispronouncing a student. So all that is to say, there are a number of very concrete mechanisms that are being used to promote this. The question then is what can be done about it? We at the Goldwater Institute are fortunate to have partnered with several other organizations. Again, Mr. Shapiro referenced this a little bit. We released model legislation with the Manhattan Institute earlier this year to abolish the DEI bureaucracy. And so that model legislation, I think you folks may have in front of you, or our suite of policies, which kind of goes through the overview. Happy to provide the language itself if that's helpful, if you don't have access to that already. But just to give an overview of the primary provisions of this legislation, the first one, as you see here, eliminates DEI administrator positions. So as has come up in the conversation, in Oklahoma and elsewhere, millions of dollars are spent each year on these DEI positions, including salaries up in the hundreds of thousands of dollar range, public positions to promote DEI. So this legislation would make very clear that public universities cannot be deploying resources to these DEI offices or DEI officers. And it does not simply, because the legislation does recognize that proponents of DEI have no problem shifting terms or descriptions of things, not to simply say you can't have a DEI officer, but to actually go in and describe what it is that is prohibited. You cannot be putting on programming with reference to race and gender that treats students differently. So it actually goes through there that they can't just simply rename this to say, well, now it's our Office of Belonging rather than our Office of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion to anticipate that. This prohibits mandatory diversity training sessions to ensure that students or faculty are not required to sit through this. Prohibits universities from requiring those diversity statements. Again, those essentially loyalty oaths that screen out applicants even before they're able to join the university system. And it prohibits racial discrimination. Obviously, the courts have taken a first step with this in terms of admissions, but to prevent racial discrimination in hiring and admissions throughout the university. The second piece of our suite of model policies, we released this with Speech First earlier this year as a complement to it. Again, that first model policy looks only at the administration, the bureaucracy promoting DEI, but that alone does not delve into the issues of content and curriculum. And again, it's very different, the approach to K-12 and higher education in terms of dealing with this, and I'll touch on K-12 afterwards. The courts, the existing precedent does, again, give more deference, makes it clearer that at the K-12 level, there's more flexibility for the states to prescribe the curriculum. This is state speech. When it comes to higher education, there's a little bit more of a gray area or unsettled law around what does or does not constitute academic freedom. So we have tried to be very precise in addressing the fact that simply because there are issues and concerns of academic freedom does not mean that we can simply walk away from this issue and say, well, we just can't touch this. We're going to continue to allow courses in DEI to be required of students, for instance. So what the Freedom from Indoctrination Act does, again, this we released with Speech First this year, has several provisions, and again, I'm happy to go into the language in particular, but overall, it would prohibit universities from requiring or coercing students to take DEI-related coursework. So that would prevent them from mandating this as part of their general education requirements or degree program requirements, but also constraining students into it by trying to find backdoors of saying, well, we're not going to necessarily require it, we're just going to make it so that the menu of courses that are offered to you are essentially going to force you into it. So again, trying to actually make sure that in practice, the universities are no longer able to push students into taking these courses. This legislation would also shield faculty from the pressure to infuse DEI content into their curricula or diversify their syllabi. I shared with you the examples earlier, as we're seeing even here in Oklahoma, to actually protect the academic freedom of faculty and students who are looking to either pursue an education or to teach their field and their subject free from an infusion of DEI principles. This model legislation also ensures that student orientation programming affirms the principles of free speech and does not force students into DEI orientation. Speech First has actually done a report on this, and they found that about 90% of freshman orientation programs included references to diversity, equity, and inclusion, and yet less than a third had anything to do with informing students of their free speech rights or the principles of free speech. And so this legislation would go on there and make it very clear that if you're operating any of this campus orientation programming, the free speech and informing kids of those rights and principles should be taking primacy over requiring them to take any kind of course in DEI or training around that. This also has a piece recommending the addition, this is an additional component, to include in general education instruction a piece on American institutions, including the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence. The two other pieces of this, and again, these are four distinct pieces of model legislation. They all fit together. They can be adopted individually or together as a package. The third one there, as you see on the top, protecting students from bias reporting systems. This one is very straightforward. It takes aim at those campus thought police that I mentioned, where they encourage students to submit reports of bias against their peers or other students. And the last one on this page is the Campus Free Speech Act. This has been passed in Arizona and other states. And this legislation, again, affirms what should be a basic understanding of the First Amendment, but makes very clear that universities need to actually uphold that mission and ensure that you're not doing things like saying, well, you're allowed to protest or have a discussion or describe why maybe you're opposed to DEI on these 5 square feet of campus. No, you need to actually uphold the First Amendment on your campus, and it ensures that you don't have student shout-downs of speakers trying to prevent. We've seen conservative speakers, particularly across the country, who've been shouted down in infringement of their speech rights, and requires the universities to adopt policies affirming the importance of free speech. Again, much of this we would think shouldn't even need to be necessary. We have the First Amendment. These are public institutions. This makes explicitly very clear additional things that the universities don't try in the interim while lawsuits are being filed that they think they can get away with trying to limit the the free speech of students or faculty. Now, I do want to touch very briefly on an issue of K-12. As Dr. Lindsay brought up, it is not simply an issue of higher education where we find issues of DEI. In fact, it is interconnected throughout the American education system, beginning in the lower grades, through higher education, and increasingly into professional careers afterwards. So I want to share a little bit about K-12 education and one other solution that we have proposed at the Goldwater Institute to deal with DEI and related topics at K-12 as well. So this is on this slide here is from Education Week, which is a education journal that historically has provided information on K-12 or higher education topics. They did a study a few years ago. This is a center, or if not center-left leaning outlet, and they did a study looking at the percentage of students and percentage of teachers and school leaders who report teaching on certain topics or that their teachers do so. And as you see on the slide, as they say, in the past year, I or our teachers have taught students about the following topics. And you see well over half dealing with issues, or near half, on issues such as race and ethnicity, national politics, immigration, climate change, LGBTQ issues. Now, again, this isn't to say what they're teaching about these, but this is to say that these issues are coming up in school. And so these are obviously controversial hot-button issues. And so the question for parents or the public is, well, what do you have to say about these things, right? Well, are you presenting these in a fashion that promotes debate amongst a high school discussion class, or is this something that is indoctrination promoting one side? But it makes very clear the magnitude of this issue, right? We've heard a lot about, don't worry, indoctrination in the schools or CRT, these things we hear they're not taught in schools. We know these topics are coming up, and so there's a question of, well, what about the topics is actually included in instruction? This chart, the only thing you really need is the top there, is that actually elementary educators are more likely to support teaching most of these complex topics. So these issues aren't simply coming up in high school. You're having elementary school teachers saying, yes, this content should be included in the K through 5 sphere as well. Some of you may be familiar with the National Education Association. This is the nation's largest teachers union. This past year, they put out a resolution explicitly calling for principles such as critical race theory, which obviously is deeply connected to DEI. You see here where they say they wish to fight back against anti-CRT rhetoric, provide in-depth study around empire, white supremacy, anti-blackness, anti-indigeneity, racism, patriarchy, cis-heteropatriarchy. You can see the long list there. And as you also see, it says we're going to teach lessons about structural racism and oppression, joining with groups such as the Zinn Education Project. So again, this is from the National Education Association, essentially giving the marching orders for what they would like to see in K-12 classrooms throughout the country. As you see at the bottom, making public statements across all lines of media that support racial honesty in education, including but not limited to critical race theory. Now, to bring this a little closer to home to you folks in Oklahoma, as I just mentioned, the NEA explicitly partnering with organizations such as the Zinn Education Project. Many of you are familiar with Howard Zinn. He is a self-described democratic socialist who says who believes in the wiping out of national boundaries. The Zinn Education Project, as you can see here, is an online resource for teachers to use, and as they celebrate tens of thousands of teachers signing up, almost 140,000 teachers from every state in the country, in which they're able to alert students to issues of racial and climate justice, for instance. And you see that map, including hundreds of educators from Oklahoma who have reported being among those using this content in the classrooms. You see on the top right there some of the content. Structural racism is a defining characteristic of our society today. Similarly, and I know this is an issue that the Chamber has looked at in the past, the 1619 Project, obviously from the New York Times, which said that the American Revolution was fought to protect slavery. Real Clear Politics has looked into this and found the 1619 Project curriculum materials being adopted in all 50 states and thousands of classrooms across the country. And as they note, it is mostly being used as supplemental material. And this is the point I want to highlight for the members here. These resources are not part of the officially adopted curriculum of most school districts. There are some, DC, Chicago, that will do this. In most cases, these materials are included into the classroom simply by a teacher or a curriculum coach or a principal thinking, this is a great supplementary resource. This does not go through any public approval process. This does not get vetted by a school district board. This simply finds its way into the classroom, as they see here, through a administrative fiat, not through a textbook review process. Now, why that matters, this is also from Education Week. This is a survey asking school administrators and teachers how often they use their core textbooks. Most of us have this conception of going to school, using a textbook, and kind of working through that each day. You see there in the red box for social studies, the darker bar is the number of days that school administrators believe their teachers are using the social studies textbook in class, 15 days a month. And the lighter bar is the number of days the teachers themselves report actually using that textbook, and you see 6 days a month. So again, further evidence that the core content that's actually making its way to students is far different from simply what's been adopted or officially used by a curriculum, and is made up largely of content pulled elsewhere. Obviously, many of you are familiar with the ACLU. Traditionally, or at least in the past, or once upon a time, a proponent of free speech, government transparency. They have come out and explicitly said things like curriculum transparency is an attempt to chill teachers and students from learning and talking about race and gender in schools, such that the Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell observed, think about that for a minute. The left is admitting in public that if the public gets a look at the racial and gender theories that they want to teach little kids, that those lesson plans will become untenable. That's what they're saying. If parents gain transparency into the crazy stuff we're teaching, we might have to stop teaching it. In other words, their reaction proves the point. The fact that woke bureaucrats are this terrified by transparency proves exactly why parents deserve it. So just a couple more slides here. This is from Robert Pondisio. He's a fellow at the American Enterprise Institute. He's a former teacher in New York. And he has commented, what the critical race theory debate misses, we don't really know what's happening in our classrooms. States, districts, and school boards have less control over what gets in front of students than do Google, Pinterest, and the lesson sharing website Teachers Pay Teachers. The fact that so much of the curriculum in American classroom is not codified in any meaningful way is an overlooked facet of the ongoing debate. So I bring all that to share the context of this in our final proposal here, which is the idea of academic transparency, to say, given the prevalence of material that is finding its way into the classroom, again, this is at K-12, which then obviously feeds into those students in higher education. To promote this idea of academic transparency or curriculum transparency, a very simple proposal of saying, have our public schools list online the actual materials that are being used in the classroom, regardless of whether or not it is an officially adopted textbook, or whether it is a video, an article, an essay, whatever it is that's actually being used in the classroom, that you would disclose that. We've actually had parents and teachers, a former teacher, testify saying, this would be a great collaborative effort for teachers and educators to find other resources that are effectively being used across the state and posting them and making them available for their colleagues. In other words, instead of having new teachers come into the system and have to go on Google to find what am I going to use to teach 6th grade history, they will actually be able to see the content from the highest performing teachers in schools and actually save themselves time rather than having to turn to issues such as the Zinn Education Project to find materials. And the final slide here, just to give a sense of this, this is one of multiple surveys that have been done to show that currently, because one of the questions that comes up is, would it not be too time-consuming for teachers to post a list of the materials? This is, again, several studies have found similar data here. Teachers report spending 4 hours each week searching for free instructional resources to use in their classroom, which again is to say that they may have a textbook that's officially as a resource, but these teachers are spending time themselves trying to find materials to use. And so rather than forcing them to reinvent the wheel over and over, the idea of academic transparency would bring accountability to the public and to parents and taxpayers, while also helping teachers be able to see what are veteran teachers using without feeling that they have to reinvent everything from scratch. So with that, I'm happy to turn it back over to the others, and thank you very much for the time.
Thank you, Matt. And if any of the legislators here would like to see the actual language, that was just high-level summary, but you know, we have a group of wonderful attorneys at the Goldwater Institute, as well as our partner organizations, who put together well-thought-out language on each of these topics. So I'm happy to provide that if you would like to see it. I'd now like to turn it over to my colleague Adam. Adam, can you tell us a bit about your impressive background and opening remarks on this topic?
Thank you, Mr. Moderator, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Senator Standridge and members. Sorry if you all can't see me down the line. Adam Kissel, I'm a visiting fellow. I focus on higher education policy for the Heritage Foundation. In my past, I spent 5 years with the free speech organization FIRE, Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression is their current name. I spent a couple of years working under Secretary DeVos as their Deputy Assistant Secretary for higher education programs. I ran about $2 billion a year in higher ed grant programs, and I've done a number of other things in the higher education sector. What you have heard, Mr. Chairman and members, so far this morning is that DEI is expensive, it's counterproductive, and it's often unlawful. There was a time when, and the state constitution shows this, when we had great deference for higher education. All those smart people off somewhere doing hard things, understanding the world and society, we'll just leave them alone, we'll give them our money and trust them. That's no longer the case, because what higher education has done so often is, instead of understand society, to try to transform it. And we see that nowhere more than in DEI, in the efforts that especially the second speaker today talked about, to transform and smash the institutions of society to build something new. And because of that social transformation agenda, I think that's one of the more important reasons we're here today, to see what we can do about it to help universities go back to their original mission of good quality research and good quality teaching, transmitting what we know to the next generation and learning new things to transmit. So unfortunately, again, you have a state constitution that doesn't give you a lot of leeway, and I want to second what Mr. Small said, that if you are, choosing to diminish funding, that's an important lever, and you can restore some of that funding in other ways through other agencies. And I think that's a smart way to proceed. Some would tell you, the first speaker especially, that somehow you have to keep DEI in the university because everyone's making the universities do it. That's mostly not true. Although it is true that accreditors have DEI standards, and you saw some of them posted, those standards don't require DEI officers. Those standards don't require DEI offices, and they don't define DEI in such a way that a university has to define it in terms of race or underrepresented groups in most cases. So what we saw, for instance, in Texas, is that a good analysis of what accreditors really require does not exclude diversity of ideas as your way, as a college, of fulfilling the diversity requirement. Now, again, the way a university does that may have to be up to the university and to the regents, and a number of the ideas that were presented by Mr. Beinberg are fantastic, but may have to be regent level instead of legislative. But there's a lot that universities can do to fulfill requirements without capitulating to the idea that you have to do it a certain way because the accreditor made you do it or the NCAA made you do it. Now, what Texas did with their SB 17 is they said, all right, if we really get stuck by an accreditor, we'll have an exception. So DEI is banned, but if an accreditor really does make you do it, you can appeal to the Attorney General and say, look, we really have to do it, and they're making us do it, but you have to show us that it's okay to, in this very narrow way, otherwise violate the rule. And when you impose those safeguards on the exceptions and say that the general counsel of the university has to say that, no, this very specific DEI program is required by the accreditor, but all those other ones are not, then it's a lot easier to define what's going on. And that's important because diversity of ideas is so important. And if you define it the right way, you want people to have diversity of backgrounds and experiences. The problem, I would say, Mr. Chairman and members, is that race and other identity groups are a poor proxy, and they use stereotypes for the actual viewpoint diversity that individuals have. So the whole idea of DEI is based on group identity, and that's the opposite of the individualism that I would say the state and the country are founded on. I would say probably if you really want to play the DEI game, the most underrepresented group in Oklahoma colleges and universities today are conservative Republican faculty members. So if you want to play that game, that's where you would go. There are a few things I think finally that are probably more regent issues or ways of solution than legislative, but I do want to mention the workforce idea, I think, has broad appeal, cross-partisan, and dramatically shifting the amount of money that goes to career colleges versus four-year institutions is probably a good recommendation. Probably we are over subscribing and over admitting people to four-year programs versus two-year programs. Get people into the workforce a lot faster at a lot lower cost without the DEI indoctrination that happens at the four-year programs. Career colleges totally different kind of person who goes to it, get them out at much lower cost. And again, I don't know what tools you have legislatively versus through the regents to do that based on your constitution, which really deserves a look. On the accreditation side, which you do have power over, anybody who does business in your state, you can regulate them without saying that you're regulating colleges. So you can say colleges must choose a new accreditor, but don't say it that way. Say accreditors may not accredit more than 10 years in a row the same institution. For instance, you could start your own accreditor, work with Florida, Texas, and a few other states that are already talking about alternative accreditors. And then you can say, no accreditor may do business in our state if they have DEI standards that cross a certain line. And what that line probably should be similar to what Texas has done and what the Goldwater and Manhattan Institute bills have suggested, which is that if you are referencing race or gender or sex or some identity group in a way that privileges some group over another, you've already gone too far. Student success for all students is great. Student success that singles out certain groups for special treatment is wrong. It might even be unconstitutional. It might even violate your state civil rights laws. So on that point, another tool you may have is to empower the executive branch judiciary, like the Attorney General, to issue fines when an institution has violated the First Amendment or has violated civil rights law through its DEI offices. And so that's on the back end. So you've already given them the money and you can't regulate them, but if they do something wrong, you can go after some of the money you already gave them if you give them due process. And then finally, on the free speech issue, I would say that the farther you reach into the classroom or into anything that a student sees or does, the more likely you are to lose in court. The longer you focus on administration and the government speech side, the government side of what you do, the more likely you are to win in court when you get challenged. And of course you will if you try to do something bold, which I hope you do. So the bottom line is that DEI is expensive, counterproductive, and unlawful. You have a lot of room, even with the tools you have as legislators, to preserve civil rights and constitutional rights and the power of the purse. So I commend you for taking up this issue.
Mr. Butcher, a little bit about your background and opening thoughts.
Thank you. My name is Jonathan Butcher, and I'm the Will Skillman Senior Fellow in Education at the Heritage Foundation. The problem with being the last speaker in a conference like this that has such distinguished guests is that they took all the good ideas, even new ones that I would have come up with if you just given me more time. The solution that we ultimately need to move to is to prohibit the use of public money for DEI offices on college campuses. That should ultimately be the goal. Now, I have a other larger principle that I'll get to here in the end that it will help to shape the potential language around what a proposal like that would look like. But with the ideas that have been given so far, I'd like to offer a couple of common potential responses from what advocates of DEI may say, and then respond to those in the hopes that that would help to clarify what has been presented already by Dr. Lindsay and by Mr. Shapiro and by Mr. Small. So first, Dr. Lindsay talked about the background of DEI and where it came from and gave its roots. And the reason that his presentation and those of others, such as my colleague Mike Gonzalez and other things that I've written and Chris Rufo, why it's so important to trace the origins is because it's not true that people know all of these things. They don't actually recognize it. And this has been measured. In fact, according to the largest corporate human resource association in the world, the Society of Human Resource Management, 71% of respondents to a 2008 survey said that their organization, quote, did not have an official definition of DEI, but 80% of respondents said that they had mandatory trainings. So even though they're not defining what this is, they are still requiring that people take these DEI trainings. This lack of direction is notable in the whole movement. DEI training programs began in the 1960s, or the concept began in the 60s, and has been rooted in a, quote, social justice philosophy, which is also, it's just a euphemism for the critical theories such as critical legal theory, critical race theory, that have replaced the classically liberal ideas of equality under the law and representative democracy with identity politics and power dynamics, as Dr. Lindsay explained. So let's be clear, DEI has used this ambiguity to advocate for racial preferences, right? On college campuses, these offices perform the political objective of advocating for racial preferences in college operations. All right, so second, as Mr. Shapiro talked about, this issue of shout downs and what's going on with the rot on college campuses of preventing free speech and individuals who are preventing others from either listening or being heard on campus. The response to this may be, well, it may be among professors and it may be in classes, but students aren't really learning it. I mean, they can't all be embracing this and using it or going off to apply it in the rest of their lives. Well, if you look online at the rash, really, of shout downs that have occurred on campuses around the country, especially over the last 10 or 15 years, listen to what the students say in these shout downs. They're using terms like what Matt brought up a moment ago, decolonization. They're using terms such as microaggression. They're talking about power dynamics. They're using these words such as safe spaces, right? They're taking all of these concepts, applying it to their lives on campus, and then preventing other voices from offering ideas that would disagree with those concepts. So this is being applied by students, especially, but not only, but especially in the area of speech on college campuses. Finally, for Mr. Small in his comments, I really commend the idea of a scholarship program to help design the way that the universities are able to help the workforce or to create and train more individuals to go out in the workforce. So are DEI programs helping this already? Do we have evidence that DEI programs are furthering the effort of preparing individuals to go off into the world to become productive citizens and productive in the workplace? And the answer is no. A study in the Annual Review of Psychology reviewed hundreds of studies of anti-prejudice training, so DEI training programs, and found that, quote, the causal effects of many widespread prejudice reduction interventions, such as workplace diversity training and media campaigns, remain unknown. Another review of the effects of anti-bias training, using the results of some 500 academic papers, finds that the trainings did not, quote, necessarily translate into changes in explicit measures or behavior, and, quote, the effects are often relatively weak. They don't work. They don't do what they say that they are doing. The McKinsey Company, the global corporate advisory organization, encourages businesses to promote diversity. They encourage DEI. They have also released reports that DEI programs fail at their intended outcomes. Even those that like DEI say that it doesn't work. In an interview with McKinsey, Harvard professor Iris Bonet said, quote, about $8 billion a year is spent on diversity trainings in the United States alone. Now I, the person being quoted, tried very hard to find any evidence I could. I looked not just in the United States, but also in Rwanda and other post-conflict countries where reconciliation is often built on the kind of diversity trainings that we do in our companies to see how this is working. Sadly enough, I did not find a single study that found that diversity training, in fact, leads to more diversity. State lawmakers for state institutions are also need to be aware of what these who are in favor, or largely in favor of DEI, are saying on the issue. So it's not just conservative organizations that are making these comments. In the Washington Post, a writer argued that DEI training programs do, quote, more harm than good. In 2020, Education Week, already introduced by Matt, lamented DEI's failings in a headline that read, quote, training bias out of teachers, research shows little promise so far. In 2022, again, McKinsey and Company released another statement warning executives with an article titled, quote, don't train your employees on DEI, build their capabilities. They're already saying because it doesn't work, you need to move on. As has been mentioned already, DEI programs and trainings are very likely going to be found to have violated the U.S. Constitution when they promote racial preferences. Businesses know this. In the Wall Street Journal recently, an article said, quote, mentions of diversity, equity, and inclusion on earnings calls and at conferences among Russell 3000 index companies fell by 54% from a year ago in the third quarter to the lowest since 2018. They already know that they don't want to talk about it. They're already removing it from their conversations in meetings. So finally, DEI doesn't change opinions. And even those in the middle or on the left, as the examples I've given you so far, have pointed this out. Writing for the New York Times, Jesse Singal asked if diversity trainings are, again, doing more harm than good. And he wrote, the specific type of diversity training that is currently in vogue, mandatory trainings that blame dominant groups for DEI problems, may have a net negative effect on the outcomes that managers claim to care about. Singal has long pointed out the problems with so-called anti-bias efforts. In 2017, he wrote in the New York Magazine that the implicit association test, which is a commonly used online test that was launched in association with researchers at Harvard to measure test takers' levels of bias, was not reliable. He wrote, this is Singal writing, a pile of scholarly work, some of it published in top psychology journals, some of which I've listed for you already, and most of it ignored by the media, suggests that this implicit association test falls far short of the quality control standards normally expected of psychological instruments. So, it does not work. It is likely going to be found to be unconstitutional. So let me give you one last concept to go back to the beginning here, where we talked about what is the ultimate goal in higher education should be to prohibit the use of public funding on DEI programs. Part of basing the language around that ultimate goal should be to prohibit compelled speech. This has been mentioned a couple of times. Mr. Shapiro mentioned it as well. But no individual should be compelled or should compel someone else, say a teacher or student, to violate, to affirm or profess any idea, but especially ideas that violate the Civil Rights Act of 1964. This would help with the loyalty oaths that Matt mentioned earlier. It would help with these requirements to use certain pronouns or address individuals by different names that are not on their official birth certificate, the teaching of critical race theory, especially in K-12 schools, and then also DEI training requirements that require individuals to profess or admit certain things that they may not have personally done. So prohibiting compelled speech is one of the ways in which the language around such proposals that we've described here can be effectively put into legislation. So with that, I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Mr. Butcher. I thought I would now turn to the question part of the Q&A panel. The problem with having such good speakers and taking long opening statements is that they often anticipate the questions and answer them in their opening statements. So I'm going to do my best. So first up for Matt. So Adam touched on accrediting organizations. So how to accredit, so with the proposals you discussed specifically, does the legislation impact or jeopardize accreditation or raise any issues around that?
So, thank you. I know we heard from, obviously, the Chancellor this morning about the pressures on universities, organizations, the Bar Association, et cetera. As was mentioned, they have statements out there saying we want diversity, equity, and inclusion, but the actual substance of that does not prescribe and say you must do X, Y, or Z to do it. As I believe Adam and Jonathan pointed out, diversity does not necessarily mean what it does to the proponents of DEI, and so a school can still be fully much in keeping with those requirements without promoting the same kind of diversity. Again, you saw the definition of diversity in the Oklahoma University example there, talking about power structures, power dynamics. That's a particular form and brand of diversity. That's not required. You don't find any of that language in any of the accreditation requirements or that. So this legislation that would defund these DEI offices would not jeopardize that accreditation. As Adam said, there can be additional provisions as a backstop if needed, but just looking at it, those accreditations are basically used as a cudgel to say you have to do this, but then they won't actually define what it is they're doing. So the universities or the legislature, if they actually stepped in and said, no, we're not going to promote DEI that promotes dividing people based upon race or gender and treating them differently, that's not going to be in violation or jeopardize the accreditation of these institutions.
Thank you for that. Adam, so the Supreme Court, as multiple speakers have touched on, recently ruled against race-based discrimination in admissions policies. So what will the downstream impacts of that ruling be on DEI offices, DEI initiatives on campus, and does it impact the need for legislative reform at all?
Thanks, Mr. Moderator. The admissions preferences that were used by Harvard and UNC were pretty clearly unconstitutional, and those kinds of preferences have been well known to be distasteful and virtually unconstitutional to the Supreme Court for decades. They just said, give us 25 years and eventually then we'll finally tell you you can't use them anymore. So there's already pretty good precedent on the Equal Protection Clause from the Constitution as well as Title VI of the Civil Rights Act that distinguishing between students on the basis of race is unlawful and can't happen. Now, unfortunately, during the past few decades, we've seen all of this DEI grow up, which is intended to distinguish students on the basis of race and other characteristics. So over time, a lot of that is going to eventually either fall by nature because the General Counsel will say, we have legal liability here, we've got to get rid of it before we get sued, or they will get sued and then that will get rid of it. So I would suggest that as the AG and the General Counsels of the institutions look at what is actually happening in DEI programs, that they think about the legal liability that they currently have by maintaining them. And then finally, we should talk about disparate impact versus disparate treatment. Disparate treatment, easy win. If you treat people differently on the basis of a protected identity, you have violated the law, you're going to get in trouble, you're going to get fined. What the U.S. Education Department has started to do is to follow what Mr. Lindsay said, the Griggs decision in the Title VII context regarding employment on disparate impact, and start applying that to Title VI in the educational context, saying that there are disparate impacts of policies. Even if you didn't intend to treat students differently, we're still going to maybe come after you. And that's what Harvard is starting to do regarding Harvard's legacy admissions policies. Well, if you start playing that game, that disparate impact is against Title VI or against the Equal Protection Clause, that means pretty much every DEI program known to man is going to have a disparate impact by design and have to fall under the Title VI rules that the Education Department has. What that means is the next Republican administration, if I'm part of the group that goes in or whoever, is armed with that tool. Every DEI program pretty much that is trying to have a disparate impact on the basis of race is going to go down.
Thank you for that. Jonathan, in the past, you've written about the use of diversity statements and the hiring process for faculty positions. Can you describe how these statements that people have described as loyalty oaths, can you describe how they enforce ideological conformity among teaching staff and administrators, and downstream of that, how they impact campus culture?
Certainly. So when a job posting is put online at a university, often a requirement in that job posting will say, as a part of your application, you must submit a diversity, equity, and inclusion statement, or a statement on diversity, or some other statement related to what the campus DEI's office says is their commitment to DEI. If it's not on the job application itself, it may be a part of the DEI office's intervention into the hiring process. It's very common for hiring committees on a university campus to have someone from the DEI office. They usually want themselves included so that they can say in the hiring process that an individual who applies must write one of these statements. And as you suggested in the question, this does create conformity, right? I mean, it eliminates the idea that someone could talk about equality under the law or the ability of anyone, regardless of their background, to be successful in a given field or in a given area. And so I think this is, let me take a quick moment to step away and look at this from what we really, and I hope Dr. Lindsay started with this, or someone as we began, everyone, regardless of the color of their skin, should have the opportunity to be successful and pursue the American dream, right? That's what we are talking about here, regardless of your skin color, regardless of your background. So what we are trying to create here, and what we are trying to now redirect, is that DEI, in part, I would argue, because of its ambiguity, has hijacked this idea of racial preferences and snuck it into everything that they do. And it's now happened without people noticing until it's too late, which is why we are here today, that what they have done is inserted racism back into the life of college campuses, back into the corporate world. And that's what we are trying to protect here. If I can, just quickly, I wanted to comment on your first question about accreditation, just very quickly. We need to recognize and echo that accreditors do in fact have DEI statements and commitments on their web pages, right? There's a small list of federally approved accreditors or regional accreditors, and Adam can talk to you more about what those look like. There's a small list here of where colleges can go for accreditation. They've all bought into this. They have this on their websites. So they are effectively imposing this. Fortunately, like Matt said, there are not specific directives, but nevertheless, they are a part of the superstructure that is in line with DEI, that is imposing this down on colleges and universities. Finally, on the SCOTUS decision, on the Supreme Court decision, so the decision, had some really terrific lines in it. One of them being that if you're going to eliminate discrimination anywhere, you have to eliminate it everywhere. They did, however, make an interesting note about military academies and a curious carve-out. So one of the downstream effects, and we are seeing this now, are lawsuits dealing with those military academies. And so that's what we are going to see, right? We're going to see states, hopefully, they're going to hopefully be following what states like Florida and Texas have been doing, right, in eliminating DEI on their campuses. But in the places where they are not, there will be lawsuits specifically targeting the use of racial preferences in different areas of public life, noting that DEI is an element of that improper use of race and a violation of the Civil Rights Act.
Okay, back to Matt now. So Florida and Texas have recently passed legislation aimed at taking on DEI bureaucracy and DEI in higher education. Many in this panel were involved in supporting that legislation, but can you just describe for the committee the results of these laws and how these laws might be improved, if at all?
So yes, as we mentioned, we have released model policies, and we've actually seen and helped get these passed in multiple states, including Texas and Florida. We have seen a steady stream of stories of offices at various Texas universities, for instance, closing up and saying we are no longer able to continue this program or this initiative that was clearly explicitly based upon the differential treatment of students. So certainly universities look for all the ways, and we've seen this with the response to the Supreme Court decision, to find ways to run around court rulings or legislation. Certainly they try to adapt, but it's been very clear that this has frustrated their ability to implement these sort of policies and programs. And so it's important that this legislation be passed in a robust form that doesn't allow them, again, to simply rebrand something and change the name and now have it elude the letter of the law, which again is why we actually crafted these things, not simply to say you can't do DEI, but to actually go in and describe what that is. What are the substantive elements of this that are prohibited, so that they can't just say, well, we didn't use that word, now we're fine. So whether in the abolishing the DEI bureaucracy legislation, it actually describes these are the activities, this is the programming that's no longer permitted, or in the Freedom from Indoctrination Act, to actually go through and describe, it's not just to say, here's a term, you can't say it, but to actually describe the concepts, that if this is what's included in the required coursework or the course description, if you are promoting these certain concepts or ideas, this is something you cannot be forcing upon students or requiring as a requirement for them to graduate. So it makes it much more difficult for them to evade.
Adam, Jonathan, any thoughts on the Texas and Florida bills?
I'll just say that the Texas bill, which I testified on, which passed SB 17, ended up making an important distinction between merely referencing race in a program, which Texas decided was bad enough that they wanted to prohibit that, and having a preference for a certain identity group. So I think the right language to go with is that if you're referencing an identity group in what you do, you're already going too far because you're trying to divide students against each other and rather than treat each student as an individual. The Florida bills have great material in them. Again, my warning about not violating the First Amendment, because you don't want to make a martyr out of a faculty member. So just be really careful and have your legal team decide what you feel like getting away with or trying to, versus and making a political statement versus what's going to end up being held up in court. But the models from Texas and Florida are great. I would also direct you to I think it's now a 95-page bill that made it through the Ohio Senate on higher ed reform, which includes many more ideas beyond what we've already talked about, and also go beyond DEI for higher education reform. Again, many of those might have to be a regents question instead of a legislative question for Oklahoma. But the National Association of Scholars has a number of model bills that can supplement what we've talked about here.
Yeah, I would add, in line with what Matt was saying, that so what someone on the who's advocating for these ideas may say is, if you get rid of DEI, if you ban critical race theory, aren't you limiting the ideas that can be discussed in the classroom and going against the very, policies that a conservative would say they stand up for? And the answer to that is absolutely not. It is not that we are saying you need to eliminate the discussion of these concepts. You need to reject the application of racial discrimination in the form of diversity, equity, and inclusion programs, or the application of critical race theory. And I mean, let me remind you, and I'm sure that Dr. Lindsay mentioned it when he was speaking as well, but critical race theory's roots, as they trace back to the Frankfurt School and the Marxists from the 1920s and 1930s, they did not just want to talk about their ideas. It is meant to be applied. In the very handbooks that explain what critical race theory is, written by critical race theorists themselves, they say that CRT has an applied dimension. It's meant to be put into practice, okay? So that is why when schools these days, when you see headlines about what's happening in K-12 schools, they are having affinity groups. They are splitting students by race for different activities. They're limiting access to playgrounds based on skin color. They are forcing or requiring teachers to go to DEI training programs. They are requiring students, as was the example in Nevada from last year, 2 years ago, where a student had to complete a statement about white privilege as a condition of graduation in a class that he was in, right? So make no mistake, we're not just saying, well, no, we can't, we're saying don't talk about these ideas in the classroom. No, we are saying you must reject the application of racially discriminatory concepts in the classroom. That should be the objective. And as Matt was saying, the legislation that he discussed defines what DEI is, and I would argue as well that the line about compelled speech is so important to say that no teacher or student or no teacher can be compelled to affirm any idea, but especially ideas that violate the Civil Rights Act. That's why it is an action that we're talking about.
Thank you, Jonathan. Matt, on this topic of academic freedom, can you expound a bit more on how the model reforms were drafted with that in mind and how they effectuate that?
Sure. So again, as I commented and showed, the left tends to use this idea of academic freedom to resist any conversation about trying to address the concerns that bodies like this have raised. And so the model legislation that we've put together, again, there's the Abolish the DEI Bureaucracies, which doesn't touch the actual classroom or curriculum. The Freedom from Indoctrination Act that we've released with Speech First does address this issue of content and curriculum that's taught. But it does not say you are not allowed to teach certain things. Again, it's the legislature or the regents, state boards of education have more flexibility in K-12 to say this shall be taught or this shall not be taught than in the university setting. But what we do have is whether the legislature or the regents, the governing bodies, the institutions who ultimately set the curriculum that are approved, it is very different to say you cannot teach this thing as opposed to this institution is going to require that it be taught, right? So it's one thing to say you are not allowed to teach DEI or CRT. It is very different. What we've done in the Freedom from Indoctrination Act is say we are not shutting down this department, but you are not allowed to require students as a condition of graduation. You are literally subsidizing these departments artificially and forcing as a condition of going through a state entity to get a degree that you have to go through this. So the model policy that we have put together says you're not allowed to make this a course requirement. You are still allowed to offer the courses, but you have to ensure that faculty have the academic freedom to teach their course without infusing DEI principles or diversification of their syllabi, and that students have the freedom to get an engineering degree or a medical degree, whatever it might be, without having to take a course focused on how contemporary United States policy promotes systemic racism. These are very different than saying we are going to prevent the inclusion of ideas. So we have tried to, again, recognize there are legitimate concerns about academic freedom, but that does not mean that we cannot address the fact that students and faculty have had their academic freedom compromised by the proponents of DEI.
Thank you, Matt. And I think we've covered a lot of information here, but I wanted to make sure to leave time for questions from the committee. So, Mr. Chair, I'll turn the time back over to you.
Thank you, Brian. Members, will there be questions? Senator Daniels, you're recognized.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. I know this came up at the beginning, Senator Standridge talking about the peculiarity of our Constitution and the authority that the Board of Regents has of the Constitution. So in your panel discussion and in your model legislation, have any of you looked directly at Oklahoma and what might work in a Texas and a Florida that wouldn't work here? Or is that something we need to follow up with you about?
Yeah, happy to have that discussion with you, Senator, and work through the specifics. We have, I know, attorneys at the Goldwater Institute as well as the Heritage Foundation that would be familiar with what that language is and how to create legislation that would be appropriate. So please let us know.
Follow up.
You're recognized.
This is really more of a statement. In 2019, we passed the Campus Free Speech Act in Oklahoma and had all the elements that you outlined in your presentation. It probably needs to have more meat added to it in light of events and circumstances since we adopted it, but certainly along with Arizona, Oklahoma did put that in place.
Will there be additional questions? Senator Standridge.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just was texting a little bit with some other senators with some questions, and I'm just really curious on the attestation of the pledge. That just seems unconstitutional in a public space. Obviously, a private employer, I would assume, could have them attest to whatever. But are there not yet any cases? I mean, you would think there was somewhere somebody didn't get a job and was bothered by that pledge or attestation. Have we not seen any cases or any disgruntled employees or non-hireds around the country that's raised some flack over that?
Thank you for the question, Senator Standridge. When some states had loyalty oaths to the United States, decades ago we saw a number of cases where a professor challenged that and won. But I think since then we haven't, I don't know of something. And I think the job market for faculty members is so challenging already, hundreds and hundreds of applicants, that if you make it known that you are the kind of person who makes trouble, you're already out of the academy. So there's very high incentives to just accept your loss and not make trouble. And I think that's the reason we see so few prospective or even existing faculty members rock the boat. And that's why it takes outsiders like us and you to stand up for them, because it's very difficult for them to stand up for themselves.
If I can jump in on that as well, Mr. Chair. It's a great question, and obviously we have seen the universities doing this, and the question is, well, then what's the response? And as Adam said, professors are going to be very cautious about getting themselves blackballed if they're going to do this. In Arizona, for instance, the Goldwater Institute actually released a report on the use of these diversity statements in the Arizona public university system, observing that Arizona in particular, in addition to the First Amendment, has state constitutional provisions prohibiting political loyalty oaths, and within a few months of the release of that report, the university regent system actually ended the use of those preemptively, recognizing that they had set themselves up for legal jeopardy. And so there is an element of legal exposure, as Dr. Lindsay had said. All these DEI issues are now potentially going to be in violation of law, given the Supreme Court actually stepping up and saying you cannot racially discriminate. We're going to uphold the 14th Amendment. And I think you are likely to see a cascade of that, including potentially in the diversity statements. I think the universities are going to be more inclined to take note if they recognize there is legislative pressure, and that if they do not act preemptively, they are exposing themselves both to the university regents or the legislatures that may be stepping in or to litigation.
Senator Standridge, follow up.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Great information, guys. Absolutely. I hadn't thought of Mr. Small's idea, and really, that sounds like a unique approach to that. What are your thoughts about if you would have one of your groups would have the resources, or the scholars group have the resources to work with legislation like that to make sure we put the teeth in, that not only as OCPA is suggesting that we focus on those areas of need in the state, which is a problem in Oklahoma. I'm sure it is in every state. And probably not a problem that's going away just because we instituted a scholarship program. But not only implement something like that to grow those areas of need, but also make sure it's bulletproof with regards to, you know, taking a bite at the apple of getting rid of this DEI. You guys, would you be willing to entertain that and look at that?
That's certainly something we at the Goldwater Institute are well positioned to do, and we'd be happy to follow up on that.
Yep, and Heritage would be as well as our sister organization, Heritage Action, which is on the C4 side.
Follow up, Senator Standridge. Will there be additional questions? Senator Standridge, you recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for hearing the study. Thank you, those that are here. I know Dr. Lindsay and Dr. Shapiro aren't here, but appreciate all the speakers that came all this way and zoomed in, so appreciate you all very much for coming. I think it's been a very illuminating study. I think that DEI, as much as it sounds good, is not good, and I think we're seeing that more and more around the country. So I look forward to working with your groups and others and trying to find a way for this body. It's not me, of course, it's a body of 48. But this body can make a difference in these kids' lives and the faculty that are really behind closed doors, I think, really getting persecuted and punished for their lack of accommodation or attestation or pledge or whatever it is, both in the kids that I hear from and in the faculty. So appreciate you very much. Again, thanks to the committee, and we will be disseminating information as well as some videos to those that are listening or here, that we'll try to get all that model legislation, everything out to the caucus. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Standridge. Thank you, members, and to our guest presenters. I think the vast majority of you traveled from out of state, so thank you very much for being here and investing your time and resources with us today. Members, we're actually a little bit ahead of schedule, so I appreciate everyone's efficiency here. We are going to recess until 2 p.m. for the next interim study on science of reading. So we stand in recess. Thank you.